Santa Maybe. A sweet romantic comedy. Christmas in Seattle Book 1. By Mazy Morris. You are listening to an AI-generated narration. This novella is available on Amazon in ebook format. The link is in the description. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Santa Maybe copyright 2013 Mazy Morris. All rights reserved. 8 days until Christmas. Madeline Morgan wove her way through the crowded mall. Half of Seattle had chosen Thursday evening to do their Christmas shopping. A trio of heavily laden shoppers almost knocked Madeline down. They pushed past her without a backward glance. So much for Christmas spirit. Madeline grumbled to her sister Ami. Ami just shrugged, shifted her shopping bags from one hand to the other, and told 6-year-old Emily, "Switch." Emily obediently wriggled from one side of her favorite aunt to the other. "Emily, you forgot to point out that Aunt Ami didn't say please," Madeline said, a bit petulantly. Christmas shopping didn't bring out Madeline's best side. Frankly, nothing about Christmas appealed to her anymore. Her ex-husband had stripped the holiday of its charm 4 years ago when, on Christmas Eve, he had informed her that he wanted a break to think things over. By break, he'd meant a 2-week holiday in Bermuda with a woman 10 years younger and 20 pounds lighter. Chad, the ex in question, was now enjoying life as a wealthy, carefree bachelor. Madeline, in contrast, was slogging through life as a stressed-out single mother the wrong side of 30 working for a nightmare of a boss who. Madeline's bitter thoughts were interrupted by Emily. "Mommy, I want to see Santa." "Please." Madeline followed Emily's pointing finger. Sure enough, there was Santa. There was also a line snaking around the white picket fence enclosure surrounding Santa's plastic iceberg throne, which looked long enough to reach back to the real North Pole. "The line's too long. It'll take 45 minutes just to get to Santa." "But I said please," Emily pointed out. "Please isn't a magic word." Ami started laughing. Madeline amended her statement. "Please may be the magic word, but it's not the same kind of magic word as abracadabra." "Can I see Santa, abracadabra?" Emily pleaded. Madeline was dead tired. She'd already put in a 10-hour day. She'd spent most of it in court representing the world's slimiest cheater. Who did he think he was, trying to get out of paying his soon-to-be ex-wife's alimony? Why did her boss keep pawning off these slime balls on her? It should be obvious by now that her heart wasn't in it. Emily was still tugging at her elbow. "I'm sorry, Emily, but I still have to find a present for Uncle Joe. I'm not coming back to the mall another day. One trip through the circus is quite enough, thank you very much." "What are you saying thank you for?" asked the ever-literal Emily. "Were all 6-year-olds such sticklers for accuracy?" Madeline ignored Emily's question and retrieved the shopping bag that had slipped from her grasp. "Joe's present won't make it to Hong Kong before Christmas," Ami pointed out. "I know, but I'd feel bad if we hadn't even bought our little brother a present," Madeline protested. "It's the fact that it's in the mail that counts. I still can't believe that we have a little brother living in Hong Kong." "Well, if you'd been offered a deal like he's getting, you'd move to Hong Kong, too," Madeline pointed out. Ami sighed. "I knew I should have gone into high finance instead of social work." "Oh, come on. You know you'd be miserable doing anything else." Emily had been holding her peace while her mother and aunt were talking, but she hadn't refrained from tugging her Aunt Ami's arm at intervals. "Well, how about you pick something out for Joe from both of us?" Ami suggested. "Light and easy to mail, unless you're bankrolling the cost of shipping." As Ami pointed out every Christmas, it usually cost 3 times as much to send the gift as the present was worth. You mean you still haven't found a way to make helping the homeless pay? Madeline joked. She sometimes teased her sister about her career choice, but at least Ami had the satisfaction of knowing that she was actually making the world a better place. Being a divorce lawyer, on the other hand, Emily still hadn't given up on seeing Santa. She resumed her tugging and made deliberately sad eyes at her aunt. "Abracadabra," she said plaintively. "Please." "I'll stand in line with Emily," Ami said. "You can finish your shopping and meet us back here." Madeline gave in. She'd be back in 45 minutes. Just in time to see Emily sit on Santa's lap, she promised. Mark Jameson gave his woolly white beard a tug. The adhesive was almost dry. Good. He was due on in 5 minutes. During his very first shift as Santa, Mark had discovered that plenty of glue was essential. That first evening, Mark's beard had been tugged off a dozen times, much to the amusement of the non-juvenile portion of the waiting crowd. Mark checked himself in the mirror. He adjusted his fake belly. Being a personal trainer wasn't the best preparation for pulling off a traditional Santa physique. Personal trainer past tense, Mark corrected himself. The past tense part was how he came to be playing Santa in the first place. "Ho, ho, ho!" Mark boomed into the mirror. He tried to make his blue eyes twinkle, but he wasn't feeling very jolly. Mark settled his white curly wig and Santa hat over his short blonde hair. He pulled on his big black boots. "You ready in there?" A gruff voice inquired from outside the door. Mark pushed the door open. It was Horace, the early evening shift Santa. "Better hurry and get out there," Horace advised. "It's up to an hour wait now, and the tots are ready to riot." Mark took a deep breath and stepped through the door. There must be an easier way of making rent. Mark spotted her before he even made it to his plastic ice throne. Madeline Morgan. Right there in line to see Santa. Her hair was short now and brunette instead of blonde. But then, he knew that already. He hadn't kept in touch with her brother Joe for nothing. Mark had spent more time than he liked to admit sifting through Joe's pictures on social networking sites hoping for a glimpse of her. Madeline was just as beautiful as he remembered her. He couldn't believe he was finally seeing her again. He'd known she was still somewhere in Seattle, but he'd made it a point not to look for her. Sooner or later, he'd figured, he'd run into her, but the years had slipped by, and up until tonight, he hadn't. It was absurd that he still had a thing for a woman he hadn't seen in 7 years. Madeline had certainly never shown a bit of romantic interest in him. To her, he'd just been the nerdy friend of her little brother. Back then, the 6-year age gap might as well have been a decade. Mark hoped his crush on Madeline hadn't been painfully obvious. Everyone around them had noticed his infatuation. Everyone except Madeline. Unless she'd just been pretending to spare his feelings. Madeline had always been so careful of the feelings of others. She probably had been pretending not to know that he was half in love with her. That was one of the qualities which had attracted Mark to Madeline in the first place. Back then, she'd been way out of his league. Still was, of course. His only advantage now was that he was no longer a scrawny, awkward kid of 19. Sometimes he felt like nothing had changed, but the mirror told a different story. It still startled him to look in the mirror, sometimes. Mark's stroll down memory lane was rudely interrupted by a kid launching himself at Mark's knees. The kid was all of 4 and had a bright future ahead of him as a linebacker. Mark made it to his ice throne and dealt with little Mr. Linebacker, who wanted a flamethrower and real-live dinosaur. Mark said he'd see what he could do. Little Mr. Linebacker slid off his knee. Madeline stood just a few feet away now. A woman Marcus recognized as her sister Ami stood with her. The adorable, curly-topped little girl clinging to Ami's hand must be Madeline's daughter, Emily. She'd look just like her mother when she grew up. Lucky girl. Pull yourself together, man. Think Santa. Be Santa. Don't make a fool of yourself. Ho, 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 boomed Mark. Hello, little girl. Emily scrambled up on Santa's lap and whispered in his ear. Her list was long and complicated. Mark had a hard time concentrating on the intricacies of Pocket Patsy dolls and their myriad accessories. Emily wanted a Pocket Patsy slumber party set. But not the purple one. The blue one. The one with the little dogs. Not the big dogs. The puppy dogs. Not the orange ones. The pink ones are better. Mark listened to Emily with one ear and to Madeline and Ami with the other. How was your date with the podiatrist? Ami was asking Madeline. He doesn't have some weird thing for feet, does he? Ami giggled. Madeline didn't look amused. She looked tired. And sad. Mark hated that she looked sad. At least she was going out on dates. Maybe she'd find someone who deserved her, unlike that Chad guy. When Mark had heard how Chad had left Madeline, he'd wanted to punch someone, preferably the cheating rotten scoundrel. He'd settled for the boxing bag at the gym. I'm going to take a break from dating, Madeline was saying. It's a waste of time. In the time I've wasted on bad dates, I could have learned to knit or speak French or... Really? Ami looked doubtful. Clearly, this was a vow she'd heard before. Santa. Please. Mark felt a little hand tugging on his beard. Is that your whole list? Mark asked. He now knew more about Pocket Patsy dolls than any grown man should, but he was hoping Emily had more specifications. He was seconds from watching Madeline walk away, and he still hadn't thought of a way to stop her. Madeline was ready to go. More than ready. Emily was taking more than her share of time on Santa's lap. The father of the little boy behind them pointedly suggested that whoever was in charge at the North Pole ought to institute a time limit. Madeline set down her bags and went to retrieve Emily. That's enough, Em. Tell Santa goodbye, and let's go. Santa, who had very nice blue eyes, was in no hurry. Are you next, little girl? Madeline looked around at the grumpy father and his young son with long blonde locks. I think that's a little boy, she whispered, trying to be discreet. She had to lean in close to whisper in Santa's ear, so close that she couldn't miss how good he smelled. She must be incredibly desperate for a man when she started thinking the mall Santa was attractive. I meant you, Santa said, lifting Emily off his knee. Tell Santa what you want for Christmas. Sit on Santa's lap, Mommy. Emily insisted. Madeline capitulated. It was easier and quicker just to get it over with. She'd tell Santa that all she wanted for Christmas was to have the dishwasher repairman finally show up when she was actually home and for whoever kept leaving bags of puppy poo on her front flower bed to drop dead, or at least catch a moderately bad cold. Madeline gingerly balanced on the end of Santa's knee, making as little body contact as possible, but Santa wasn't having that. He wrapped both arms around her and pulled her in close. His woolly beard tickled her ear. He smelled so good. Tell me, little girl, have you been good this year? Madeline was sure her face was the same color as Santa's crushed velvet suit. Incredibly good, Madeline said and tried to extricate herself, but Santa held on tight. Perhaps that's the problem, Santa whispered. Madeline just sputtered and made another half-hearted attempt to stand up. I'll let you go when you tell me what you really want for Christmas, Santa said. Madeline felt herself choking up. I just want to be happy, she whispered in Santa's ear. Or is that too much to ask? This was insane. She was on the verge of tears. Stupid Christmas. Stupid dreamy, blue-eyed Santa. Stupid dreamy, blue-eyed Santa pulled her in even tighter. She could feel his heart beating in his chest, but that big Santa belly was certainly not real. Abruptly, stupid blue-eyed Santa recognized that he was engaging in behavior unbecoming to St. Nicholas and let her go. Emily was asking what she'd asked Santa for, and Ami was handing her shopping bags back to her. Everything around her was a blur. Madeline felt dizzy. She must be coming down with the flu. It had been going around the office. Just that morning, their receptionist had gone home sick. Madeline started walking away. Since neither of her hands were free, Emily clung to her coat tail. They got outside the picket fence before Madeline noticed Ami wasn't with them. Ami was talking to Santa. She handed him something small and white. What were you doing back there? Madeline demanded as soon as Ami came back. Just giving Santa my card, Ami said. Santa was coming on to you, too? No, he was not. Ami insisted. Why, did he come on to you? Ami was wearing her I'm deliberately playing dumb just to get on your nerves face. She'd been playing that trick ever since they were kids. Madeline ignored the question, but she refused to let the matter drop. Why were you giving him your card? I need a Santa for the Christmas party tomorrow night. Every year, the week before Christmas, the homeless shelter where Ami was director threw a party for the residents. Most of the women had kids, and any Christmas party for kids requires a visit from Santa. Cover your ears, Madeline instructed. Then she turned to Ami. Isn't Wesley playing Santa again this year? Wesley was the shelter's handyman/cook. Wesley is on permanent furlough. You mean you fired him? Yes. I had no choice. Don't you have any male friends who can play Santa? As a matter of fact, I do. I just made a new one who was delighted at the prospect of playing Santa. He was even more delighted when I told him he could count on having a beautiful elf to assist him. You didn't. I did. And don't try to weasel out of elf duty. You know I'm already operating short-handed without Wesley. I'm just not comfortable with that Santa. Madeline hesitated. She confirmed that Emily still had her hands over her ears. Emily also had her eyes screwed shut for good measure. That little girl never did anything by halves. He was practically kissing my neck, Madeline told Ami. That wasn't strictly true. At best, it was an exaggeration, but she wouldn't have minded if he had kissed her neck and that was a problem. Maybe his other job is a vampire impersonator and he got temporarily confused about his role, Ami joked. I don't think that's very funny, said Madeline. I wondered what exactly was getting you so hot and bothered. I was not getting hot and bothered. Personally, I find it a refreshing change that you found a man capable of making you blush. You find something wrong with every man you go out with. I do not. Actually, Ami's accusation was uncomfortably close to the truth, but Madeline wasn't about to admit that her younger sister was right. And I was not blushing. Ami just arched one eyebrow. Besides, how attracted can I be to a man I've only seen in a Santa costume? Pretty attracted, judging by the look on your face. I thought you were going to spontaneously combust up there. I was not. Madeline lied again. All right. All right. Ami said. Maybe I misread the whole situation, or maybe you have an until now undiscovered thing for men in Santa costumes, but I'm not throwing away a perfectly good St. Nicholas, and I'm still counting on you to play elf tomorrow evening. 7 days until Christmas. Mark stood with his hand on the door to the Hospitality House Women's and Children's Transitional Shelter. He shouldn't have waited until he was downtown, Santa suit in hand, to indulge in second thoughts. It wasn't wise, getting himself involved with a woman he'd been crazy head over heels in love with. He'd made a fool of himself already. There was no reason to make an even bigger fool of himself. Or maybe there was. He couldn't go on for the rest of his life comparing every woman he met to Madeline. He'd built her up in his mind to the point that no other woman could compete. He needed to see her again, just to burst the bubble of his fantasy. Besides, there was little danger of anything actually happening between them. It had been hard to tell the night before, as she sat on his lap, whether her reaction to him had been simple embarrassment or something else. He hoped he hadn't come across as a total jerk. When it came to unwanted attention, he was usually the one on the receiving end. That was how he'd come to be unemployed. He'd turned down the wrong woman. The last thing Mark wanted to do was subject Madeline to unwelcome advances. Well, he was about to find out if Madeline would recognize him out of costume. He doubted it. There was barely any resemblance between his appearance now and the scrawny kid he'd been at 19. He'd been a late bloomer. Very late. There was also the problem of Ami. He'd spent time with Ami only 3 years earlier. He and Joe and Ami had taken a trip down the Oregon coast right before Joe moved to Hong Kong. Ami was sure to recognize him out of costume. Mark took a deep breath and opened the door. Matchstick! Ami looked back and forth between Mark's face and the Santa suit. You're a dreamy Santa. I should have recognized your voice. Well, I'm Santa anyway. The dreamy part is open to interpretation. Ami launched herself at Mark and gave him a big hug. Madeline's going to freak out when she finds out it was little Matchstick Jameson that made her blush. Mark was enormously pleased with this assessment of Madeline's reaction to him, but he tried to play it cool. Don't tell her, he said. I want to see if she recognizes me. I seriously doubt she will. You look nothing like a matchstick anymore, you're so. Ami playfully squeezed one of Mark's biceps. I personally go for highly tattooed, skinny, commitment-phobic musicians with ridiculous amounts of facial hair, but I can certainly see what women might see in you. Mark wasn't sure how much of a compliment that was, but he said thanks anyway. Hurry and get your costume on. Ami pushed him down the hall toward her tiny office. Don't let Madeline see you yet. It'll be much more fun this way. The lock on the office door is broken, but don't worry. No one will walk in on you. Madeline was late arriving at the party. Chad was supposed to have picked up Emily at 6, but he hadn't shown up until 7. She'd also had trouble getting into her elf costume. It seemed to have shrunk since last year, or maybe it was all that stress eating she'd been doing. No, the costume had definitely shrunk. Still, once she'd managed to pour herself into the tights, she'd been relieved to see that she still made a cute elf. She'd done up her eyes with heavy liner and green shadow and used extra blusher to make the apples of her cheeks pink. It was a lame attempt to cover up any real blushing she might be doing later on, but it was worth a shot. The party was already in full swing when she walked in the door. Mothers and children were working on decorations. Some were sitting at tables making paper chains and eating cookies. Others were overloading the tree with tinsel. A couple of the more forward mothers had backed Santa into a corner and appeared to be trying to flirt him out of his crushed velvet Santa suit. Madeline found this behavior far more distressing than she ought to have. Dreamy Santa seemed to be holding his own, but contrary to his behavior when she'd sat on his lap at the North Pole Christmas display at the mall, he didn't appear to be the least bit inclined to flirt back. Ami came up looking harried and gave Madeline a quick hug. She shoved a cookie into Madeline's hand. FYI, Ami whispered in her sister's ear. I saw Santa without his Saint Nick gear, and he's spectacular. Before Madeline could comment on this revelation, Ami scurried off. Madeline took a bite of cookie, just what she needed to ensure that, next Christmas, she really wouldn't be able to get into those elf tights. Ho, 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 boomed Santa from his corner. Look, everybody! My helper elf has arrived. She's brought your presents in from my sleigh. The presents! She'd forgotten to retrieve the bag of presents from the back storeroom. Madeline thought fast. Actually, Santa, it turns out the bag was so full of presents that it was too heavy for one elf to carry. Maybe Santa would like to help me bring it in. What do you think, kids? Do you think Santa should help me bring the presents in? Yes! Screamed the kids. The room vibrated with the energy of 24 children hopped up on fruit punch and way too many cookies. I don't remember where I parked my sleigh, said Santa. Miss Elf will have to show me. Madeline grabbed Santa by the arm. It was an impressive arm, even swathed in the cushiony costume. This way, she hissed. Madeline was hoping Santa wouldn't smell as good as she remembered, but he did. She also wished Santa's eyes didn't have quite such a roguish twinkle, as if he could read her thoughts. Madeline dragged Santa to the storeroom and pointed to the bag. It didn't look very heavy. This is the heavy load you needed help with? Santa inquired. I was buying time. I forgot to bring in the presents. Really? Yes. Really. Santa was standing very close to her now. So close that she could see green flecks in his blue eyes. Are you sure? Santa reached out and brushed a cookie crumb off the corner of her mouth. Madeline swallowed hard. She was suddenly and uncomfortably aware that there was nothing she'd like more than to be kissed by the Santa impersonator underneath a sprig of mistletoe. Fortunately, there wasn't any mistletoe. Ahem! Ami interrupted from the door of the storeroom. You'd better get back out there. A few of the Munchkins are discussing forming a search party. I'm afraid that when they find you, they plan to tie you both up with extension cords, abscond with the gifts, and divide the loot. They figure they can take Santa, but they think Miss Elf is a tough cookie. Tough cookie is an exact quote, by the way. Madeline wasn't sure if Ami was joking, but she was grateful for the interruption. What was she thinking? She'd been thinking about kissing a man she'd only met last night. She didn't know his name, she'd never even seen his face. By the way, Madeline, said Ami as she shooed them out into the hall, this is Mark. Mark, this is Madeline. I don't believe you've been introduced. Madeline stuck out her hand, and Mark took it. Instead of shaking it and giving it back, he held on to it. Madeline could feel herself blushing again. She looked over at Ami. Ami was smirking. Madeline yanked her hand back. Anyway, Ami said, we're all going out for a drink afterward. It's on me to thank you for helping. And I have a check for you, Mark. Oh, that's okay. I wasn't expecting to get paid, Mark insisted. I was able to trade shifts. Madeline was curious. What did this man do besides play Santa? Being a Santa impersonator was hardly a full-time job. Come on, Ami said and hurried them down the hall to the waiting crowd of kids. Mark stood in Ami's tiny office. Distributing gifts to the kids had been fun. He understood why Ami had devoted her life to this kind of work, although he imagined there were a lot of dark moments, too. It wasn't all parties and presents. Mark kicked off his boots, unbuckled his giant black belt, and shrugged out of his crimson crushed velvet coat. He pulled his fake belly vest over his head. It felt good to get out of his Santa suit. It was starting to feel like he lived in the thing. He wasn't about to miss going out for a drink with Madeline and Ami, but he hadn't brought along his spirit gum solvent, so he'd have to go with his Santa beard still glued to his face. It was just as well. He didn't mind putting off the moment when he'd have to reveal his face to Madeline. He found the Santa costume gave him courage he didn't know he had. He stepped out of his Santa pants. There was a rattling at the door. The handle turned, and it opened. Madeline, still in her elf costume, stood framed in the doorway. For a moment, she stood stone still, mesmerized by the sight of Mark standing in the middle of the tiny office wearing a bright green union suit with ho, ho, ho printed all over it. Madeline held a duffel bag in one hand. She had obviously come to the office to change out of her elf costume. Mark broke the silence. Gag gift. I only wear M when I'm Santa. Helps me get in character. Madeline didn't say anything. She seemed utterly mesmerized by that bright green union suit. Perhaps it was horror at his poor taste. Could you close the door, please? Mark asked. Sure, sorry. Ami told me to come change in here. Of course, Ami had. Mark couldn't have asked for a more hardworking Cupid than Ami. Madeline started to back out of the room. That's not what I meant. Mark moved toward her. Madeline paused again. Mark took Madeline's wrist and gently tugged her into the room. Then he reached out with his foot and nudged the door closed. He wasn't going to kiss her, but he'd make sure she realized she wanted him to. Madeline was feeling dizzy again. This time it was no use blaming it on the flu going around. She had to face facts. Santa/Mark was having a very curious effect on her. Mark stepped toward her. Madeline moved away until her back came into contact with the closed door, and there was no space for further retreat. Mark stopped short of making full-body contact, but Madeline was acutely aware that inches away was a man capable of making her go weak in the knees, even fully swathed in a ridiculous neon green gag gift union suit. She had to remind herself to breathe. Mark reached up and put a hand on either side of her face. He cradled her head. Madeline let herself relax against the closed door, but she pressed her palms flat against it. She wanted to reach out and see if Mark's heart was beating as fast as her own, but she resisted the urge. Madeline closed her eyes and soaked in the feeling of Mark's thumbs caressing her cheeks. She felt surrounded by a cloud of love. Then her eyes snapped open. This was ridiculous. This man didn't love her, far from it. Only a complete player would act like this with a woman he hadn't even taken out for a cup of coffee. Mark sensed the shift in her mood. He leaned down, brushed his lips across her forehead, and removed his hands from her head. Then he moved away and pulled jeans over the ridiculous union suit. The room seemed suddenly cold. Madeline didn't know whether to leave or to stay. Mark pulled a sweater on over his head. He gathered up his Santa costume in one hand and picked up his boots with the other. "See you out there," he said and left her. Madeline sat down in the middle of the floor. She felt like crying for the second time in as many days. What was it about this man that made her so acutely aware of what was missing in her life? Love. Love was missing. But the kind of man who came on the strong to strange women was not a good bet for finding the kind of lasting love Madeline was looking for. If it weren't for Emily, she'd be tempted to have a fling, but a fling was out of the question. Madeline had a rule. She never went out for more than 3 dates with any man who wasn't husband material, and she never ever brought men home to meet Emily. As it had turned out, since her divorce, she hadn't met a single man who was husband material. Oh, well. She'd go have a drink with Mark and Ami. That might be the last she'd see of him. Just one drink. Or maybe 2. She was sure she'd lost her chance with Mark. He'd given her an obvious opening to move things along at breakneck speed, and she hadn't taken it. It was just as well. Men like him were quick to move on. She wasn't looking for a man like him. Mark watched Madeline across the table. He knew he was staring, but he couldn't help it. She avoided his eyes and concentrated on her glass. She was out drinking her sister 3 drinks to 1. Mark wondered how often she drank like that. It wasn't celebratory drinking. It was more of the drown your sorrows variety, and it made him sad. Everything about Madeline made him sad. It wasn't that he wanted her and couldn't have her. He could live with that. It was seeing her so miserable that devastated him. All these years, he'd imagined Madeline being a happily married wife and mother. In pictures, she'd always looked happy. Apparently, the pictures hadn't been telling the whole truth. Mark nursed his 4th seltzer. He wondered who would end up driving Madeline home. He hoped it would be him. Ami, content to carry the conversational ball, chattered away about her neighbor who was renovating an old Victorian next door and who kept her up nights with his sawing and hammering. They'd been at the bar since 9. It was midnight, and still, Madeline had said barely 3 words to Mark. Apparently, she was not one of those people whose tongues got looser the more they drank. So, Mark, Ami inquired, "How's the personal trainer game going?" Madeline looked up from her drink for the first time in half an hour, but she still didn't say anything. Mark was afraid Madeline might ask how Ami knew what he did for a living, but this didn't seem to occur to her. Not so good. How so? I got fired 2 weeks ago. Long story. Go ahead and tell it. We have plenty of time. Well, the short version is that I didn't want to date one of my clients. She's actually something of a local celebrity and has lots of connections around town. She's a local news anchor. If I told you her name, you'd recognize it. Anyway, the long and short of it is that she doesn't take rejection well, and I find I've been blacklisted at pretty much every gym between Ballard and Bellingham. That's how I came to be a professional Santa impersonator this holiday season. I'm sorry, said Ami. Madeline here is trying her best to get fired. She hasn't succeeded yet, though. Mark was surprised. You hate your job that much, Madeline? Yep. Madeline said. I'd like nothing better than to go in Monday morning and... She made a sweeping gesture and knocked her empty glass off the table. It rolled underneath their feet but didn't shatter. Where do you live, Mark? Ami asked. In a houseboat on Lake Washington. Madeline was making a fumbling attempt to retrieve her glass from under the table. Did you hear that, Madeline? Ami stuck her head under the table. Mark lives in a houseboat on Lake Washington. Isn't that interesting? There was no answer from under the table. Ami came up for air. Madeline has a house in the University District, she informed Mark. Would you mind driving her home? Mark didn't have to be asked twice. Madeline made some noise about Ami sending her home with a strange man, but Ami argued that Mark wasn't that strange of a man. This reasoning made no sense to Mark, but it pacified Madeline. It turned out that Madeline lived less than half a mile from Mark. She'd lived in the same place for years, so had Mark. All this time, they'd been that close. Madeline fell asleep in the car. When they got to her house, Mark pulled up in the driveway and went around to the passenger side. He opened the door and undid Madeline's seatbelt. She opened her eyes halfway. "You're home," Mark told her. "Sleepy. So sleepy. Am I going to have to carry you in?" She wasn't that drunk, but he didn't mind. She didn't seem to mind either, because she got out of the car under her own power and wrapped her arms around his neck as she swayed against him. "Sleepy. Yes, I think we've established that. Where is your key?" It was in her bag. He fished it out and picked her up in his arms. He had to put her down on the doorstep to coax open the stubborn lock, but he picked her up again and carried her over the threshold. Which way? He had no idea where to go from here. He finally located a light switch, and light flooded the room. They were standing at the foot of the stairs. "Too bright," complained Madeline. He switched the light back off. "Where to? Shall I put you down?" "No, upstairs." Mark carried Madeline up the stairs. Down the hall. They were in her bedroom now. He set her down on the bed. She clung to his neck. "You'll be okay now." "I have to go." "Don't go." "I should. Please." He couldn't see her face. Was she that lonely? So lonely she got drunk and begged strange men to spend the night? Mark loosened her arms from around his neck and fumbled around until he found a lamp and switched it on. Madeline was curled up in the fetal position on the end of the bed. Her shoes were still on, and she appeared to have fallen asleep again. Asleep was good. Now he could slip away. But first, he'd take her shoes off. He got the first shoe off without waking her, but she stirred when he attempted the second. "Don't go," Madeline begged. "Promise." "How about I stay until you fall asleep?" "Then, I won't fall asleep." She looked so rumpled and vulnerable. Her perfect makeup from earlier in the evening wasn't so perfect anymore. Her eyeliner was smudged around her eyes. She reminded Mark of a depressed raccoon. "Yes, you will fall asleep. I give it 3 minutes. Promise. Promise me you'll stay." "I won't sleep. I promise." Staying was the last thing he should do, but he did it anyway. He tucked her into bed fully clothed and then lay down on top of the bedspread and watched her fall asleep from the other side of the bed. He didn't touch her except to move a stray strand of hair that draped across her eyes. She didn't stir. Strangely, she looked happier asleep. Mark hoped that she at least had happy dreams. 6 days until Christmas. Madeline woke up as it was growing light. She always woke up early, even on the weekends. Even when Chad had Emily and she could have slept in as late as she liked. She turned over and nearly screamed. There was a man in her bed. He lay on top of the bedspread wrapped in his coat fast asleep. As he breathed in and out, his woolly white beard floated up and down with each breath. Mark. Of course. It was coming back to her. She'd been pathetic, completely pathetic. She wanted to die. Maybe, if she pretended to be asleep, he'd wake up and leave. Then she wouldn't have to face him. She was about to put the pretending to be asleep plan into action when Mark opened his eyes. He looked startled for a few seconds, then broke into a big grin. He reached up and stroked his Santa beard. "Spirit gum has amazing staying power," he said, giving the woolly white beard a little tug and readjusting the knitted cap he wore to cover his short blonde hair. Madeline didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything. Mark rolled over to face her. They were feet apart, but that was still too close. "Listen," Mark said, "I don't want you to." I'd rather we didn't talk about it. Nothing happened. Something most certainly had happened. She'd acted like a pathetic, desperately lonely idiot. She should get up. Maybe he'd take the hint and leave. Mark reached across and touched her cheek. You look pretty awful. This unexpected insult made Madeline laugh. She jumped out of bed and fled to the bathroom. Mark was right, she did look pretty awful. She camped out in the bathroom as long as possible, hoping to hear the front door open and shut behind him. Instead, she heard rattling downstairs in the kitchen. Then, the unthinkable happened. The doorbell rang. The doorbell ringing at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning could mean only one thing. It would be Chad on the doorstep, claiming that Emily had forgotten something so essential that he had to invade the only scrap of alone time she ever got. Madeline suspected that these little excursions to retrieve forgotten items rarely originated with Emily. Chad might value his freedom to have overnight guests whenever he wanted, but he wasn't too keen on Madeline doing the same. Mark was downstairs in the kitchen. Chad would put 2 and 2 together and make 7. And Mark was still wearing that ridiculous Santa beard. He looked like a weirdo, a hot weirdo, but a weirdo nevertheless. Please don't answer the door, she silently begged as she raced toward the stairs. Please, please, please don't answer the door. She was too late. Mark was opening the door. Sure enough, it was Chad. At least he was alone. Emily must be waiting in the car with Carmen, Chad's latest girlfriend. Hi, Mark was saying. Chad appeared speechless. Madeline had never seen a speechless Chad. How can I help you? Mark tried again. I just. Madeline interrupted this gratifying display of confusion. Hello, Chad. Hello, Maddie. Chad always called her Maddie. Madeline hated the nickname. How had she never gotten around to telling him so? I expect you're here to get something for Emily. Well, come in. Madeline was finding this a lot more fun than she'd expected. I'd better check on my eggs, said Mark. Eggs. Mark was making breakfast. In all their years together, Chad had never once cooked breakfast for her. Chad came inside and stood there. What did Emily forget? Oh, her plaid coat, Chad said, but made no move to take the little pink and green plaid coat in question off the hall coat tree. Maddie, who is that? Oh, that's Mark, Madeline answered. No, I don't care what his name is. I mean, who is he? Some homeless guy I picked up down by the tracks. One look at those big blue eyes, and I knew he was the one, so I asked him to move in the same day we met. He tells me we can't get married because he's wanted by the FBI, but I expect that it's all just a little misunderstanding that'll soon get cleared up, and then it'll just be him and me till death do us part. You remember that part of the wedding vows, don't you? Okay. Chad was holding up his hands as if to defend himself from a frontal attack. Chad had never appreciated Madeline's sense of humor. Well, ask a stupid question. It's not a stupid question. My daughter lives here. In case you've forgotten. That's when Madeline lost it. You are unbelievable. How many overnight guests have you had in the last 6 months? Mark is the first man who's spent the night, well, since you moved out. And Emily is not even here in case you hadn't noticed. I can't believe you're standing here lecturing me on. Women have to be more careful. There are a lot of creeps out there. Madeline wanted to pick up the umbrella stand and break it over his head. You're right. There are a lot of creeps out there. And you know what? The biggest creep I know is standing right in front of me. Chad laughed. He'd always said she was cute when she got mad. Just remembering all the times Chad had refused to take her seriously made Madeline even angrier. Get out! Take the jacket and leave. Chad was still laughing. He took the jacket down off the coat tree but made no move to leave. Out! Madeline was practically screaming. Mark came out of the kitchen, stood behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and tucked her head under his chin as if that was something he'd done 1,000 times before. I think the lady asked you to leave, mate, he said to Chad. Don't call me mate. All right. Mark held Madeline a little tighter. I'll make myself clear. Walk out that door and shut it behind you. This guy is a trip. Chad said to Madeline. You sure you're safe here alone with him? He has an even bigger temper than you. Madeline was so angry she was shaking. She didn't dare speak. Mark let go of her and walked toward Chad. He was shorter than Chad by several inches, but he had a lot more muscle. It was obvious to Madeline that a fight between the two wouldn't come out in Chad's favor. Chad must have realized that, too, because he backed out the door. As he walked down the sidewalk, he turned back to fire a parting shot. You should know you've got a card-carrying ice queen on your hands. Get used to it, Chad said to Mark. Then he added a kicker obviously meant for Madeline. You know you drove me to it. None of this is my fault, and you know it. Madeline lunged out the door, but Mark pulled her back. Don't give him the satisfaction, he said. Madeline was still shaking. She buried her head in Mark's chest. He might turn out to be an even bigger jerk than her ex-husband, but, at the moment, he was warm and strong and smelled like sweat, cologne, and a hint of frying bacon. Mark held her for a few minutes, stroking her back. Finally, he gently detached her. What you need, he announced, is something to eat. Mark watched Madeline eating eggs. She was so cute. He had an ache in his chest that could mean only one thing. He hadn't just been in love with the long-ago Madeline. He was halfway to being in love with the present-day version, all 5'3" of her pathetic messed-up little self. Not that he wasn't in worse shape. A man who had to resort to playing Santa at the mall to make rent wasn't much of a catch. This was not how he'd planned for his life to turn out. By this time, he'd expected to own his own chain of gyms, or at least one. But no. He didn't even own the furniture in the houseboat he rented. He didn't own much more than the clothes on his back if you didn't count Festus. Festus! The poor dog hadn't been walked since yesterday afternoon, no telling what kind of mess he'd made. Madeline, I just remembered something I have to do. Madeline looked up from her eggs. He couldn't tell if that was a look of disappointment or relief. One moment, he'd think he could read her like a book, and then she'd go all coy, and he didn't have a clue. Sure, she said like she didn't care one way or the other. Thanks for the eggs and, with Chad. I can throw my weight around when the occasion calls for it. Yes, you certainly can. Mark walked around to her side of the table and kissed her on the cheek. I'll run upstairs and get my coat and then I'll be out of your way. He didn't give her time to reply. He took the stairs 2 at a time up and down again. He slid across the slick hardwood floor of the entry and flung open the front door. Bye, he yelled in the direction of the kitchen. He didn't wait for a reply. Mark started his ignition. Her number. He didn't have her number. He almost turned off the engine and went back in but changed his mind. He'd ask Ami for it. That was better. There were a few questions he'd like to ask Ami. He'd have asked Madeline herself, but he didn't have the nerve. Festus had made a mess. He regarded Mark with solemn reproach in the doggy way that bulldogs have perfected. Mark got his Santa beard off and took Festus out for a quick run. Then he sat out on his deck. He pulled Amy's card out of his wallet. He dialed her number and patted Festus on the head while he waited for her to pick up. Madeline lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, phone to her ear. Amy had temporarily abandoned her in the middle of a call. She'd be right back, Amy promised. Someone else was calling, and she had to pick up. Madeline looked over at the other side of the bed. There was still an indent in the bedspread where Mark had been laying. She reached over and placed her hand in the middle of it and then quickly withdrew her hand. Silly. Very silly. Still, last night had proved that Mark definitely wasn't the player she thought he was. Players don't put tipsy women to bed fully clothed and then spend the rest of the night sleeping on top of the bedspread wrapped in their coats. It was sweet. Or was it? Maybe it meant that he wasn't attracted to her anymore. Sure, he'd acted like a gentleman, but that was just a minimum requirement for being a decent human. But why had he stayed? He could have gone home. Did he really like her? Madeline wasn't sure. Pathetic groveling seemed like a definite turn-off. Madeline had let Mark see what a mess she was, and now she was regretting it. Mark was going to disappear out of her life, she just knew it. Maybe that's what she wanted. She couldn't make up her mind. 1 minute she couldn't wait to see him. The next minute she was mentally scheming ways to fake her own disappearance to avoid facing him again. So, that was your Mark. Amy was back. He's not my Mark. He isn't? Well, you could have fooled me. Well, you're wrong. Don't you want to know what he wanted? Not really. Oh, come on. It's me, Amy, your sister. You don't have to play it cool with me. In fact. Fine. Tell me. He wanted your number. Oh. I found it odd that he had to ask me for it, considering that you spent the night together. How did you know that? Mark may have let something slip out. Nothing happened. Yes, he took great pains to make that clear, but I hear he cooked you breakfast. Amy. Tell me what's really going on. Be honest. Madeline took a deep breath. Amy was right. If she couldn't be honest with her own sister, who could she be honest with? Amy, I really like him. Am I nuts? No. I am 100% sure you are not nuts. How can you be so sure? Let's just say I know something you don't. What do you know? It's a secret. Tell me. Well, if I told you it wouldn't be a secret anymore, now would it? I don't get it. No, I don't imagine you would. Mark will call, and he'll tell you something that will blow your mind. 5 days until Christmas. Mark didn't call Madeline that day. He'd meant to, but things had gotten crazy. He'd planned to spend the day dropping his resume at the gyms he still hadn't gotten to. He didn't hold out much hope, but it wasn't in his nature to give up until he'd exhausted every possibility. Early on, he'd gotten lots of bites, but every time he thought he had a job nailed down, they'd call back and say they'd changed their mind. One manager came right out and admitted that he was scared to get on Kristen Murphy's bad side. Kristen Murphy, socialite, anchorwoman, and millionairess. The woman was well on her way to ruining his life, and then she showed up in person at his home. Fortunately, Mark spotted her coming down the dock. He barely had time to lock the door and scoot out of sight around the corner. Festus went ballistic even before Kristen knocked. The bulldog launched himself against the door. That dog had never warmed to Kristen. Mark should have taken Festus's distrust of her seriously from the start. "I know you're in there, Mark," Kristen shouted over Festus's frantic attempts to get out and tear her to bits. Kristen knocked again. "Come out. I have a proposition for you." Mark suspected what her terms would be. The city was full of men who would jump at a chance with Kristen Murphy. The woman was extraordinarily hot if you were the type who could get past her fundamental evilness. Mark wasn't one of those men who could, but he was sure there were plenty of others out there who'd have no problem dating the devil if the devil looked like Kristen Murphy. Okay, Kristen wasn't giving up. "I know you can hear me, so I'm going to." It sounded like Kristen had escalated from knocking to attempting to kick the door in. It wasn't much of a door. She might succeed. Mark gave up. He called off Festus, shut him into the tiny bathroom, and opened the door. Kristen stood outside with her hands on her hips. She tried to push inside. Mark didn't let her. He stepped out the door and closed it behind him. "What you're doing is completely unethical," Mark said. Kristen pressed herself up against Mark. He stepped to the side. Some people didn't believe women could be predators. Those people had never met a woman like Kristen Murphy. "It's not that complicated," Kristen said, pouting. "I know what you want, and you know what I want, so let's negotiate terms. Meaning, you'll make sure I get my job back if I agree to be your January toy boy." It sounds so crude when you put it like that. Kristen laughed without an ounce of mirth and reached out to stroke Mark's cheek. He moved away. "You'll change your mind," she said. "I won't. I mean it. I'm not interested." "Not even interested in your own gym?" "I have a friend who is looking to sell. Great location. I could make that happen for you." Now she had his attention. How did she know what would tempt him? He knew he had hesitated too long when Kristen smiled triumphantly. "Of course, my name would be on the deed, too," Kristen added. "No," Mark said, trying to make up for his hesitation by answering too loudly. "I don't think you're too sure about that, no?" "Listen, Kristen. Why can't you just leave me alone? There's no shortage of men out there who'd." "I don't want other men. I want you, and I always get what I want." Mark ran out of words. He backed up silently and shut the door in Kristen's face. But Kristen wasn't done. She yelled through the door. "You have until Christmas Eve, or you'll find out what happens to men who turn me down." Kristen waited for a reply, but Mark was silent. "Don't underestimate me, Mark Jameson. You have no idea what I'm capable of." Mark was shaken. He took her threats very seriously. He'd already seen the damage she could do. He toyed with filing a police report. If what Kristen was doing didn't count as stalking, no, bad idea. He had no evidence. Kristen had been careful to make all her threats in person. There were no incriminating texts. No threatening emails. No vicious handwritten notes. He couldn't even present a phone log as evidence. Kristen had stopped calling once he'd terminated their professional relationship. No, it was up to him to get out of this one on his own. Madeline sat at her dining table. It was strewn with documents pertaining to the case of the odious Mr. F. Madeline hated Mr. Foster. It was not uncommon for Madeline to represent clients that she didn't like, but this was different. She hated Felix Foster with a dark-hearted rage. She ought to excuse herself from the case, but then she'd have to admit to her boss, Angela, that Mr. Foster reminded her of an elderly version of her ex-husband. Madeline wasn't about to endure the humiliation of a lecture from Angela about not letting one's personal life interfere with one's work. So, here she was, spending her Sunday afternoon trying to come up with new and creative ways for Felix Foster to cheat his faithful wife of 42 years out of as much of their community property as possible. She wouldn't put it past Mr. Foster to try to eject his wife from the family home with nothing but the coat on her back. It was useless. Madeline couldn't concentrate. She wandered into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee. It was her fourth. The dishes from breakfast still sat on the table. The chair where Mark had been sitting was still scooted out, and the skillet was still on the stove, bits of egg clinging to it. Madeline walked over and grasped the handle. For hours ago, Mark had been standing in her kitchen, in front of her stove, holding on to that handle. Madeline let go of the handle and started to laugh. She laughed until tears ran down her cheeks. This was so ridiculous. She was behaving like a lovesick teenager. She was one step away from running upstairs to see if he'd left any hairs on the pillow. The whole situation was bizarre. She tried not to wonder what Ami had meant by secret. What could there be about Mark that Ami knew, and Madeline didn't? It couldn't be anything bad, or Ami wouldn't have been so playful about the whole thing. Ami sometimes pushed Madeline out of her comfort zone, but when it came down to it, Ami took her sister's well-being very seriously. Ami might be 2 years younger than Madeline, but she was very protective. So protective that after Chad left her, Madeline had been afraid that Ami might do something drastic. Madeline hadn't been worried for Chad's sake. In fact, free from her own ethical scruples and fear of prosecution, Madeline would have quite happily gone along with some of Ami's creative ideas for making Chad suffer. No, Ami would never encourage Madeline to get involved with someone she didn't trust 100%. But how could Ami be so confident about Mark? How could Ami be so trusting of someone they had only just met? It was completely uncharacteristic. It was a mystery. Madeline gave up. She swept Mr. F's files back into her attaché case and spent the rest of the afternoon on the couch eating jam straight from the jar and watching reruns of trashy soaps. Chad brought Emily home early. 3 hours ahead of schedule. He did not come to the door but sent Emily up onto the porch alone to ring the bell. Emily staggered into the house under the weight of her overstuffed pink backpack. "Did you have a good time?" "It was okay." "What did you do?" "We had waffles." "That's nice." "Mommy, what's a—" Emily hesitated. "What's a what?" "I think it might be a bad word. I don't want to say it out loud." "That's okay. You can whisper it in my ear." When Emily whispered the word in her ear, Madeline blanched. She didn't know what to say, so she played for time. "You're right. That is a very ugly word." "Where did you hear it?" she asked Emily. "Daddy called you that." "He said a lot of other stuff, too, but I can't remember it." "Let's take your backpack off." Madeline was hoping that Emily would drop the question, but she hoped in vain. "What does that word mean?" Madeline knelt down to look into Emily's eyes. "You know how your friend Sydney told you she didn't want to be your friend anymore, and we talked about how sometimes hurting people say mean things just because they want other people to hurt just as much as they do?" Emily nodded. "Well, that's a word grown-ups use when they want to hurt someone else on purpose." "Oh." Madeline gave Emily a hug. "There. Not bad." One of these days, she was going to win Best Co-Parent of a Child with a Horrible Human for a Father award. But why does Daddy want to hurt you on purpose? "I don't know." That was the truth. Madeline had no idea. 4 days until Christmas. Mark knew he had to tell her. He couldn't let Madeline go on thinking he was just some random guy. But, by telling her, he risked her finding out about his ridiculous decade-long crush on her. That was potentially humiliating. Sure, Madeline was clearly attracted to him, but that didn't automatically translate into her wanting to get involved in a serious relationship with him, and he was serious. He was serious about Madeline in a way he hadn't been in a long time. If Mark was honest with himself, he'd never been this serious about any other woman. He'd better start by asking Madeline out on a real date. It might be best to try and keep things as normal as possible. Ice skating and burgers. Fun, but not trying too hard. He didn't want to come on too strong, but it was a little late for that. Mark dialed Madeline's cell. It was the middle of the morning, and she must be at work. He'd leave a breezy message. Keep it light. He knew exactly what he was going to say, but then he didn't. She picked up, and his memorized speech was useless. Madeline Morgan speaking. Should have texted. How can I help you? Of course. She wouldn't recognize his number. Hello, Ms. Morgan. Santa here. Madeline giggled a very unprofessional giggle. Just a minute, she said. Mark heard voices in the background, then the sound of a door closing. Where are you? Mark asked. Copy room. Really? Is that where you go to conduct all your clandestine affairs? Madeline giggled another even less professional giggle. Don't worry. I'm not going to try to engage you in copy room behavior unbecoming of an attorney in good standing, Mark continued. He heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. He imagined Madeline leaning against the copier and fanning her flushed face with a sheaf of copy paper. Sorry, Mark said. He had to watch himself. He needed to think before he spoke. I called to see if you'd like to go ice skating this evening. There was a long silence on the other end. Did she really have to think about it that long? I'll have to get a sitter for Emily. You can bring Emily if you want. No. That was it. No explanation. If he didn't know better, he'd think that Madeline had zero interest in going out with him. I thought I could pick you up around 6, he suggested. Can I get back to you? Sure. Madeline huddled on a folding chair in the corner of the copy room, grasping her phone. She wasn't fanning herself, but that was only because there wasn't anything handy to use as a fan. Why hadn't she said yes to Mark already? She knew that Ami was free that evening and that she'd be happy to watch Emily. Taking Emily along was out of the question. Madeline never introduced her dates to Emily. She texted Ami to ask if she could watch Emily. Ami texted back right away. Date? Why? Mark? Why? 6. Okay. See ya. Ami arrived at 5:30. Madeline had barely been home 10 minutes. Emily had had a rough time at after-school care. Her friend Sydney was being mean again, and Emily had lost her favorite barrette, but she was excited that Aunt Ami was coming to spend the evening with her. Aunt Ami always brought junk food. Madeline never fed Emily junk food. Junk food was Ami's thing. Emily ransacked Ami's bag as soon as she came through the door. Ami surrendered a package of Santa-shaped gummies and a tin of Christmas cookies covered with icing that looked radioactive. Now, said Ami, turning her attention from her niece to her sister, what are you going to wear? This is what I'm wearing. Madeline had managed time to change into her baggiest, most unflattering sweater. The orange one. Orange was not her color. Ami caught Emily in a bear hug and covered her ears. Did I miss something? Is frumpy the new sexy, and nobody told me? Ami! So, you're deliberately obliterating any desire he might have to get, overly friendly? Yes. All right, Then, good job. Ami released Emily's ears, then immediately covered them again. May I ask why? No, you may not. All right. Ami let Emily go and dropped the subject. Mark arrived exactly 5 minutes late. He had to sit out at the curb for 10 minutes to manage to be perfectly late, but it was worth it to avoid either overeager promptness or I don't respect you tardiness. Ami opened the door. Hi, Mark, she yelled, launching herself at him, much like Festus did when Mark had left him alone all day. It was an exuberant, uninhibited hug. Mark wondered how someone as warm and smart and funny as Ami hadn't been snatched up yet. The only man she'd mentioned was her next-door neighbor, the loud guy. That didn't sound too promising. You're going to tell her tonight? Ami said. It was half question, half order. Probably. Maybe. How about definitely? Why definitely? Because the longer you wait. Ami didn't get a chance to finish. Madeline was coming down the stairs. Where was Emily? Mark wondered. Ami must be there to watch Emily, but Emily was nowhere to be seen. Madeline came down the stairs. She was wearing the ugliest sweater Mark had ever seen. She also looked as if she'd skipped putting on makeup. Mark grinned. Hello, beautiful. Madeline was pulling out all the stops to make herself as unattractive as possible. That could mean only one thing: she was afraid she would find any move he made irresistible. He laughed. Madeline didn't join in. She was staring at him as if mesmerized. He'd completely forgotten that Madeline hadn't yet seen him without the stick-on Santa beard. This might be it. He might not even have to broach the subject of being Matchstick Jameson, after all. Madeline might figure it out on her own. Or not. Ami snapped her fingers under Madeline's nose, and when she got no reaction, she gave Madeline a sharp shove between the shoulder blades, which sent Madeline lurching forward into Mark's arms. There, announced Ami, as if she just checked something off her to-do list. She brushed her hands together and headed off to the kitchen. Mark was hugging Madeline, but she wasn't hugging him back. Shall we go? He said. Apparently, she didn't recognize him as Matchstick Jameson, but seeing what he actually looked like still had her flummoxed. Madeline mentally slapped herself upside the head. She was behaving like an idiot, and she knew it. Mark looked even better under that beard than she'd imagined. There was also something comfortingly familiar about him, but that was impossible. She would remember having met him. Any woman would remember having met him. She grabbed her coat and shoved herself into it before Mark could try to help her. Madeline found Mark's old-fashioned gentlemanly habits disconcerting. She was used to doing things for herself, and she liked it that way. The trip to the skating rink was quiet. Mark seemed alternately amused and nervous. He didn't try to get her to talk. They drove in silence, but after a few minutes, he turned on the radio. He whistled along and tapped the steering wheel in time to Frosty the Snowman and Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer, the former of which Madeline had always found tragic and the latter of which vaguely disturbing. Madeline was a good skater. She'd taken lessons when she was a girl. Mark wasn't so good. It was a major accomplishment for him just to make a complete circuit around the rink without falling down. He fell often and hard. Madeline tried to hold him up, but he had a good 80 pounds on her, and that meant each time he went down hard, so did she. Enough, said Mark finally. He clung to the wall all the way to the nearest exit and sat down on a bench. Giving up already? Madeline teased. Seeing Mark flailing awkwardly helped, somehow. He wasn't perfect, after all. No, I just need a rest. You go ahead and go back out there. You spent the whole time trying to hold me up. You deserve a few rounds without me pulling you down every 50 feet. But Madeline didn't want to leave him. She was starting to have fun, and she was feeling less nervous, but her jitters could come back anytime. She'd better tackle the question that had been plaguing her before she lost her nerve. Ami said you have something to tell me, Madeline told Mark. Did she? Yes. Ami is a very honest person, isn't she? Yes. She believes in putting things right out there, said Mark. Yes, she does. What about you? Where do you stand on complete honesty? I'm strongly pro-honesty, Madeline said. And you have no idea at all what I might be about to tell you? Not a clue. All right, I'll give you a clue, Mark said. We know someone in common. Madeline racked her brain. She couldn't think of anyone who knew Mark except her sister, and surely that didn't count. Ami only just met Mark, too. However, it was the only guess she could come up with. Ami? She asked. Well, yes, but I'm thinking of an even closer connection. Think further back. We went to school together? Madeline asked. No, you're too young. How old are you anyway? Not important. Mark smiled. Come on, tell me. How old are you, then? I thought you were the one giving away his secrets, Ami pointed out. All right. This should help. We did go to the same high school, only not at the same time, Mark said. That didn't help. Madeline was completely stumped. Still, there was definitely something familiar about him. You were a classmate of Ami's? You're getting warmer. You used to date Ami. No, you're not her type. Not even close. But you're on the right track with the friends of siblings thing. Joe. You're an old friend of Joe's. Bingo! But I don't remember you, Madeline said. You must be a college friend. I barely met any of his college friends. I was too busy with law school. No, I'm not a college friend of Joe's, Mark insisted. But I knew all of his high school friends. He had them over at the house all the time. That's right. I was over there practically every day. Madeline couldn't believe it. It couldn't be. Now that she looked closely, she guessed it could be possible. Blue eyes? Yes. Blonde hair? Yes. A little taller, but lots of boys grew a little more in their late teens and early 20s. You're Marcus Sylvan? That was all Madeline could come up with. Mark didn't look any too happy, but that had to be it. Joe had only one friend named Marcus. True, Marcus hadn't been a very close friend of Joe's, but he must have been over at the house more often than Madeline remembered. Mark still hadn't said anything. I'm right, aren't I? Madeline asked. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but, just then, Madeline's phone jingled. Mark closed his mouth again. It was Ami calling. Ami couldn't resist calling to see how the date was going. That must be it unless something had happened to Emily. But what could happen to Emily at home with Ami? Stupid question. Anything could happen. Ami had never really grown up. The last time Ami had watched Emily, Madeline had come home to find all her throw rugs at the bottom of the stairs. Ami and Emily had been using them as sleds. It had been Ami's idea. Don't panic, was the first thing out of Ami's mouth. Oh, no. It must be bad. It must be broken bones, or worse yet, a head injury. Maybe there had been an intruder, and he'd kidnapped Emily, and Ami was calling to tell her. Or perhaps, the intruder had kidnapped both Emily and her aunt, and Ami was tied up in the back of a van somewhere down a dark, cold alley with a gun to her head. Maybe, Ami was calling to relay a ransom demand. What happened? Madeline found her voice. It's nothing serious, but I thought I'd better go ahead and drive Emily to urgent care. Madeline nearly dropped the phone. The emergency room? Why does Emily need to visit the emergency room? Madeline could hear herself screeching. Mark looked concerned. The woman on the next bench also looked concerned. If Madeline got any louder, the boy running the concession stand across the rink would probably start looking concerned, too. I told you not to panic. Ami sounded maddeningly calm. Don't tell me not to panic again. Just tell me exactly what happened. Well, we were playing this game, see? What kind of game? You know those Santa gummies I brought? Yes. Well, we were having a contest to see who could snort a gummy the farthest. What? Madeline was screeching again. You know. We were putting gummies up our noses and then snorting them back out. Madeline did a little snorting of her own. Don't worry, Ami continued. I discouraged her from eating previously snorted gummies. You still haven't gotten to why you're in the emergency room. Urgent care. Big difference. Ami spoke slowly as if speaking to a dim-witted child. All right. Why are you in urgent care? Emily may have snorted in instead of out, at one point. May have? Well, they haven't found Gummy Santa yet. They haven't actually started looking. There are 2 bad backs, an asthma attack, and a case of suspected measles ahead of us. Ami! I know. I know. I'm sorry. She did sound sorry. I probably should have led with the I'm sorry. Mark couldn't figure out exactly what was going on, but urgent care didn't sound good. Madeline got off the phone with Ami. She turned to Mark. Do you mind? I don't want to take the time to go home and get my own car. Sure. No problem, Mark said. What happened? Gummy Santa's snorting contest gone bad. Madeline looked less panicky, but Mark knew better than to laugh. It only took 10 minutes to get to the clinic. Emily was in high spirits. She sounded like she had a bad cold when she talked, but otherwise, she seemed to regard the trip to urgent care as a treat. She showed off the stickers the intake nurse had given her. Emily seemed mildly curious about who Mark was and why he was there, but that was it. She certainly didn't appear to have made the connection between Mall Santa and Mark. That was a relief. You don't have to stay, Madeline told Mark. He couldn't tell whether she wanted him to leave or stay. Maybe, she hadn't yet made up her mind herself. I don't mind. Really? It's going to be ages, and after we're done here, I think it's best if I just take Emily home. Okay, I guess I'll be going then, Mark said. We'll have to try the skating thing again some other time. Madeline didn't want him to stay, so he'd go. Emily and I haven't eaten anything yet, well if you don't count Santa gummies, Ami piped up. Did you guys eat? You must be hungry. I sure am hungry. Emily said she was hungry, too. Madeline didn't say a thing. No, we didn't get anything to eat, Mark said. He had decided that Madeline must want him to go, but he was wavering on his resolution to leave. I could go get food for everybody and bring it back here, he offered. That's a great idea. Ami winked at Mark. Madeline didn't notice the wink. She appeared fascinated by an article in a women's magazine dated from July of the previous year. Or she would have appeared fascinated if Mark hadn't observed that she'd been reading the same page over and over again ever since she'd picked it up. Mark was back in 20 minutes with burgers for everyone. His date with Madeline might not have turned out as he'd planned, but at least they would still end up the evening eating burgers together. On the way back from the burger place, Mark had started to worry that Ami might blow his cover while he was away. Why hadn't he spoken up immediately when Madeline had wrongly guessed his identity? He was going to have to set the record straight as soon as possible. He just hoped Ami hadn't inadvertently already done it for him. When Mark walked back into the waiting room with burgers and fries for everyone, he tried to gauge Madeline's expression, but she looked the same as when he'd left. Ami grabbed a burger and bit into it as if she hadn't eaten in days. Emily took hers apart and ate each ingredient separately. Madeline thanked Mark for the burger, but she left it in the wrapper. Ami inhaled her own burger, scarfed down her own fries and half of Emily's, and then she got chatty. "So, Madeline," Ami asked, "did Mark tell you he?" Mark didn't let Ami finish. "Yeah," Madeline was pretty shocked to hear that I was Joe's old friend Marcus Sylvan. Mark said Marcus Sylvan way too loud, but he couldn't risk his point passing over Ami's head. Rarely did anything go over Ami's head. She smiled a fake smile and slapped him on the back, a lot too hard. "Little Marky Sylvan." Ami slapped him on the back again even harder. "Difficult to see any resemblance to the boy he was in high school, huh, Madeline?" "I wouldn't have known if he hadn't told me, for sure," Madeline said. Mark hadn't told her. This was all wrong. He was digging himself a hole. He should correct Madeline right now because there wasn't going to be a better time. "I could have sworn that in high school you had green eyes, Marky Sylvan," Ami said. Mark tried to remember what color eyes Marcus Sylvan did have. He couldn't remember much about Marcus Sylvan, but the little he did remember made him not at all sure that Marcus Sylvan was someone he wanted to be mistaken for. "You know what? I know you're Marcus Sylvan, but out of all Joe's high school friends you actually remind me a lot more of." Madeline was suddenly animated. Mark thought about cutting her off, but he was too curious not to let her finish. "Who was that guy, Ami?" Madeline said. "You know that skinny little guy who had such an enormous crush on me?" Ami almost aspirated her cola. "He had a funny nickname," Madeline continued. "What was it?" "He was such a sweetheart, though. Remember after my law school graduation when I lost that?" Ami recovered her composure. "You must mean Matchstick?" "That's him," Madeline said. "You remember him, Mark? Poor homely little thing. I thought it was kind of mean to call him Matchstick, but it certainly was an appropriate nickname." Ami glared at Mark. He was sure that if they'd been sitting at a table, she would have been kicking him under it. Mark pretended to be thinking. Ami sat with her arms folded while giving Mark the stink eye. Madeline looked up. A harried nurse was calling for Emily Morgan. Madeline took Emily's hand and followed the nurse. When she looked back, Ami was still glaring at Mark. That was very odd. Ami liked Mark. Why was she angry with him all of a sudden? They got the gummy Santa out. The young doctor, who had the grace not to laugh, put the offending candy into a Ziploc bag and handed it to Emily. "Put it under your pillow," the doctor said. He smiled at Madeline. "You might get a visit from the nose fairy." Now Emily was sure to stick things up her nose every chance she got. This man obviously had no kids of his own. The doctor bent down to Emily's level and said in a very solemn voice, "But remember, the nose fairy visits only once in your lifetime. This is your big chance. Never, ever stick anything else up your nose again." Well, maybe he did have a kid. He understood how the typical kid's mind worked, anyway. "Okay," said Emily. Then remembering her manners, she added, "Thank you." Madeline wanted to get Emily home as soon as possible. It was well past the kids' bedtime. Emily had far too much excitement, and tomorrow was a school day. Emily would be a wreck by the time the school day ended. When they got back out to the waiting room, Mark was gone. Ami still looked angry, but she gave no explanation for either Mark's absence or her own stormy looks. By the time they made it back to Madeline's house, and Emily was safely tucked in bed, Ami was ready to spill the truth. "Well, almost ready." "What's going on, Ami?" "Not much." "Don't play dumb." "You're mad at Mark." "Why?" "You know how Mark told you that he's—" Ami paused and pulled out her phone. "You know what? I'm going to make him tell you himself." "Tell me what?" Ami ignored the question and dialed. "Hello, Mark," she said into the phone when he picked up. "Just for the record, you're a world-class wuss. Here's my sister. Tell her the truth." Ami handed Madeline the phone. "Hello." Mark didn't sound too happy. "Hi." "What's Ami talking about?" There was a long pause on the other end. "You know how you guessed that I'm Marcus Sylvan?" "Yeah." "Well, think back. Did I actually tell you that I'm Marcus Sylvan?" Madeline thought back. She remembered guessing right before Ami had called. No, he hadn't actually told her who he was. "You're saying you're not Marcus?" "Well, according to my birth certificate, my name is Marcus, just not Marcus Sylvan." "Is the part about being a friend of Joe's true?" 100%. "But Joe only had one friend named Mark?" "You never knew me as Mark." "Oh. It couldn't be." Mark couldn't be Matchstick, although she'd come up with that thought herself. She'd even laughed at the idea. No, it was too mortifying. She hoped it wasn't true after all the insulting things she'd said about him. "Matchstick. Are you Matchstick?" "Yes." "Mark, I mean Matchstick, I mean Mark, I feel terrible." "Don't worry about it. You didn't say anything about me that wasn't true." Madeline didn't know what to say. "Why don't we save this conversation for when we're both a little less tired? How about dinner tomorrow evening?" Mark suggested. "I can't. Tomorrow evening is my office Christmas party." Madeline hated her office Christmas party. "Oh. I really do have to go," Madeline said. "Believe me, I'd rather spend the evening with you." "I'm sorry." There was an obvious question hanging in the air. If she wanted so badly to spend the evening with him, why didn't she invite him to go as her date? It wasn't like she already had a date lined up. No, she wasn't ready for that. "How about later, after the party?" "I can come by your house," Mark suggested. Madeline would come home after Sadie, her regular sitter, had put Emily to bed. That should work. Her "no men in the house when Emily was home" rule was getting shot to pieces, though. "Okay. How about 11 o'clock? I'll slip out of the party early." 3 days until Christmas. Mark's day started out badly. It had snowed during the night, and he had to shovel a path down the dock before he could take Festus out for his walk. When he returned from walking Festus, there was a message scraped into the frost on the windshield of his car. "Christmas Eve. Don't forget. Kristen." It had to be Kristen. Mark snapped a photo of the message. It didn't amount to much. On its own, it was hardly threatening. He had to decide what he was going to do about Christmas Eve. He'd get up early Christmas morning to drive out to the Olympic Peninsula to spend Christmas with his parents and assorted relatives, but his family had no Christmas Eve tradition. He certainly didn't plan on sitting at home all evening, waiting for Kristen to show up. Whatever he decided to do on Christmas Eve, he'd have to make sure Festus was out of harm's way. He didn't think Kristen would hurt a dog, but he wasn't sure enough to wait to find out. Festus hated Kristen, and he suspected the feeling was mutual. Mark wondered what Ami and Madeline did for Christmas Eve. Their parents had been killed in a car accident. It would be 10 years they'd been gone that coming Easter. Ami, Joe, and Madeline had all been devastated by the loss, but Mark suspected that Madeline had had the worst time recovering. Over the years, Ami and Joe had made several comments about how responsible Madeline felt for her younger siblings. They might all be grown-ups now, but Madeline still felt it was her role to keep the family close. They still had grandparents in town, so they probably went there for holidays. Mark shouldn't be thinking about what Madeline was doing for Christmas. Even as well as things had been going, at least up until yesterday evening, it was too early to think about spending a holiday together. Maybe he'd go to a hotel and take Festus with him. That's what he'd do. He hoped he wouldn't come back to find all his windows broken out, or worse. Frankly, Kristen terrified him. Mark was no psychiatrist, but he didn't have to be one to recognize that the woman was a sociopath. He'd have to figure something out about Festus. In the meantime, he needed to talk to a friend. It was already midnight in Hong Kong, but Joe was a night owl, and this was an emergency. Joe picked up after the 8th ring. He sounded happy to hear from Mark, although it was obvious that Mark's call had woken him up. They chatted about this and that for a while before Mark got around to the real reason he'd called. "So, I ran into both your sisters a few days ago." "Great. I keep telling you to call them up." Mark wondered if Joe would be so positive if he knew the sort of thoughts Mark had been having about Madeline. "Well, things have gotten a little complicated." "Even better. You finally got up your nerve." "Only took 7 years, but still." Joe was taking this better than Mark had hoped. "Not that kind of complicated." "Well, possibly." Joe made him spill everything down to the last detail. Unfortunately, although Joe offered his enthusiastic support, he had far less to offer in the way of constructive advice. Madeline hasn't gotten involved with anyone since the divorce. She'll go out with a guy a couple of times, but then she always kicks him to the curb. After they'd talked about Madeline for a while, Mark told Joe about Kristen. "Have you told Madeline about Kristen?" Joe wanted to know. Mark hadn't. He didn't intend to. What was the point? It wasn't like he needed to complicate things further by hitting Madeline up for free legal advice. "I think you should," Joe insisted, "and Ami, too. You have no idea how scary Ami can be when she goes into mother hen mode." Mark didn't say he wouldn't tell Madeline and Ami about Kristen, but he didn't say he would either. Joe didn't press him further. Instead, Joe asked Mark for a favor. It wasn't a big favor, and Mark agreed to do it. He knew he'd have nothing better to do on Christmas Eve anyway. "Sure." "What time?" 10 a.m. "There's one more thing." Mark smiled as he listened to Joe on the other end of the line. The second favor was a lot bigger. And gutsy. It was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Madeline would never see it coming. Madeline was late for work. She'd overslept. Emily was tired and cranky and had a meltdown on the drive to school. Getting out of the car at the office, Madeline snagged her hose. Maybe no one would notice. "You have a run," Angela announced as Madeline made her way down the hall. "I know. You don't have a spare, by any chance? I do. I always keep one in my bag. Of course, she did. Madeline bet Angela never ever forgot to replace her spare pair either. Angela went to retrieve the hose from her bag. So, who are you bringing to the party tonight? Angela asked as she thrust the hose into Madeline's hands. Angela asked this every year. Madeline, just as she had every year since her split from Chad, said she'd be coming on her own. No man of the moment? Angela said, the clear implication being that Madeline couldn't manage to snag a man for even that long. Actually, I am seeing someone. Madeline couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. Was she seeing someone? It was too soon to tell if Mark would become a fixture in her life, but Madeline wasn't about to backtrack on her statement to Angela now. Her pride, what little there was left of it, was at stake. Angela arched one perfectly plucked brow. He's an old friend. We reconnected recently. Madeline floundered for an explanation. You should bring him to the party. Ah, I think he has to work. That was probably true. Although Mark had offered to take her out to dinner, so maybe he was doing the afternoon shift at the North Pole. Oh, what does he do? Angela always asked what people did. She was that kind of woman. Part-time Santa impersonator? Madeline had a reckless urge to say that out loud just to see the shock on Angela's face. Mark's a personal trainer. Personal trainer. Very nice. Pays dirt, but still. Madeline didn't say anything. Great body, I bet. Madeline wasn't in the mood to discuss Mark's body with her boss. That was a conversation she would never be in the mood for. Does he usually work nights? Isn't that kind of unusual for a personal trainer? He has a couple of clients that only have time in the evenings. Well, tell him to come down to Mackinac when he's done. We'll be there until at least midnight. Mackinac was the bar where they had their Christmas party every year. It was one of those faux Irish pub places with a back room that Angela would rent for the evening. Madeline had never seen the appeal, but then she didn't have to foot the bill for the party, so who was she to complain? Madeline had a meeting with Mr. Foster, the cheating rotten liar, right before lunch. She still hadn't come up with a plan to ensure he'd avoid paying alimony. Frankly, she didn't care. The secret was to be authoritative and convincing when she told him so. If he'd been a different kind of man, she'd have appealed to his compassion and reason. Unfortunately, Mr. F was neither compassionate nor reasonable. Mr. F arrived at 11 o'clock, and Madeline broke the bad news. Mr. Foster didn't take it well. Predictably, he blamed everything on his soon-to-be ex-wife. It was all Madeline could do to keep her opinions to herself. At one point, she clamped down on her tongue with her teeth. Every time she had to deal with Mr. Foster, it was getting harder to behave professionally. At least he hadn't caught on to the fact that he had a lawyer who didn't give a flying flip if he walked away with nothing but the shirt on his back. Oh, well. She'd have to deal with him again in court, but, if she was lucky, this was the last time she'd have to see the man in her office. Madeline's afternoon was better. While she was taking a late lunch, she got a call from her brother. Joe got straight to the point. I hear you've been seeing my friend Mark. Seeing is a loaded term. All right, spending time with. I suppose you could say that, but I only ran into him a couple of days ago. So, I heard. What do you think of Mark, honestly? I think he's great. He's no Chad if that's what you're worried about. He has this wicked crush on you, you know. I do remember that much. I can't imagine that makes any difference now. No? Are you just going to ignore that I was speaking in the present tense? That's ridiculous, said Madeline. Is it? So, while we're being honest, how old is Mark? Not sure, said Joe. My age, I think. His birthday's in July. So 24-ish. You have no idea how old I am either, do you? Madeline made a quick calculation. Joe was right. Her little brother's age was something she should know. 26-ish, she said. Much better. Joe, I have to go. I have a meeting in half an hour. Did I tell you it's the dreaded office party tonight? Taking Mark? No. I am not. Why not? Don't you think it's a little premature to be taking him to a work function? No. Well, I do. Suit yourself, said Joe. You'd have a much better time if you took Mark. That was probably true. Bye, Joe. Be good. I'm always good. I know. Joe was gone. She'd talk to him again on Christmas Day. She missed Joe. Hong Kong was too far away. Mark had spent the morning doing rounds of all the remaining fitness centers on his list. The result was the same as it had been every other day. No one would touch him. The community center wasn't even interested in hiring him as a lifeguard. Mark couldn't believe the influence Kristen wielded. He wouldn't have imagined that just one woman scorned could make such an impact on his future. He was Santa for the afternoon shift. Horace called in with a cold, so Mark pulled a double shift and spent 10 hours in the Santa suit. He came home exhausted. He got his beard off and took Festus for a walk around the block. Then he opened a can of baked beans for himself and a can of beef and gravy for Festus. He hadn't eaten since before he suited up to be Santa. He avoided eating while wearing the beard. It was almost impossible to get crumbs out. Mark's phone dinged. He had a new message from his friend Stan. Stan owned a chain of fitness centers in Portland. The text simply said, "This could be yours. Interested? Call me." There was a photo attached. It showed an empty storefront in a strip mall. Definitely worse for the wear, but it had possibility. Mark dialed Stan's number. "So, what do you think?" Stan's voice boomed over the line. "About what?" "Your own gym, man." "I know, the building's a little run down." Mark could care less about the building being a little run down, but he tried to play it cool. "You opening another location?" "Yep, and I heard you were at loose ends, and I thought I might be interested." "Tell me more." "Well, I could either offer you a very generous compensation package to start up and manage the place for me, or I could offer you a share of the business instead." "How big of a share?" "Big enough to make it worth your while." Mark believed him. Stan was a straight-up kind of guy. This was a terrific once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Mark should be jumping up and down, but he wasn't. Why wasn't he? There was nothing for him here. No job. No hope of a job. No stability, only a crazy woman stalking him. Why wasn't he saying, "When can I start?" "I am interested," Mark said. "Dude. I expected you to be more stoked about this." "I know. I know. I should be. I am grateful for the opportunity, it's just that." Stan started laughing on the other end. "You've finally met the woman of your dreams." "Well, sort of." "What do you mean, sort of?" "She's someone I knew when I was in high school," Mark said. "High school sweethearts?" How adorable. I think I'm going to cry. Not exactly, Mark said, ignoring Stan's sarcasm. She was starting law school when I was a senior. Older woman. Very nice. I was crazy about her. Must still be crazy about her. A little. A little? Dude. I'm offering you your dream opportunity, and you're about to say, I'll think about it and get back to you. I'll think about it and get back to you. Madeline slipped into her little red cocktail dress. It was tighter than it had been last Christmas. Too much jam jar binging. She'd bought the dress right before Chad had informed her that he wanted a separation. She hadn't even worn it that year. It looked great on her, though, so despite the bad memories attached, she kept it. She saved it for occasions where she didn't plan on having a good time but had to make a solid effort to look like she was enjoying herself. Madeline called Sadie to make sure that she'd gotten Emily from after-school care. She didn't need to, but she did it anyway. Sadie wasn't quite as good as Aunt Ami in Emily's book, but Sadie was still a fun babysitter. Sadie let Emily do crafts and make messes. Sadie also made sure the messes got cleaned up, which made her a winner as far as Madeline was concerned. Madeline was one of the first to arrive at the party. This was intentional. If she was going to sneak out early, she'd better show some enthusiasm at first. Besides, there was always a good buffet, and the sooner she got there, the less picked over it would be. Angela came right over before Madeline even had time to grab a plate. So? Angela demanded. Merry Christmas, Angela. Where's this dishy personal trainer of yours? I wouldn't call him dishy. Well, actually. But Angela had temporarily lost interest in Madeline's love life. She'd spied someone she knew coming in the front door. She left Madeline and hurried out to the bar. Madeline loaded up her plate. She didn't have to get into the dress she was wearing again until next year, so why not enjoy herself now? Out in the bar, Angela was carrying on a very animated conversation with a striking woman who looked familiar. Madeline racked her brain and finally placed her. The woman was a local news anchor. Madeline couldn't hear what they were saying, but it appeared that Angela was urging the woman to come in and join the party, and the woman was pretending to have something better to do. Minutes later, Angela interrupted Madeline's conversation with the firm's accountant, Clarence. Clarence was showing off pictures of his newest grandbaby, but Angela practically shoved Clarence out of the way to introduce Madeline to the woman she'd brought into the back room with her. Kristen, this is Madeline, my. Angela was spectacularly bad at introductions. Last year at the Christmas party, she had introduced Madeline to someone as her youngest. Angela had meant, of course, that Madeline was her youngest attorney on staff. The man being introduced had assumed that Madeline was Angela's youngest daughter. It had been embarrassing for all three of them. Hello, Kristen. Lovely to meet you. Madeline stuck out her hand before Angela had a chance to put her foot in her mouth. Kristen took Madeline's hand and looked her over appraisingly as if trying to ascertain where Madeline stood in the pecking order before letting go of her hand. I'm going to get some food, said Kristen and headed for the buffet. Angela took this opportunity to grab Madeline's arm and pull her to the side. Angela's fingernails gripped Madeline's arm like talons. Take care of Kristen for me, Angela hissed. Huh? If we can get on as her personal legal counsel, then we're gold. Why does a news anchor need personal legal counsel? Madeline couldn't help asking. Well, Angela lowered her voice. Let's just say she occasionally gets overly enthusiastic when it comes to men. You mean she makes a habit of engaging in stalking and harassment? Madeline hadn't been a lawyer all these years for nothing. I wouldn't put it quite that way, said Angela. Let's just say it would be a very lucrative account. She's a Forrester. A Forrester? You've heard of the Forrester family, surely? Her parents died a couple of years ago and left her everything. I see. Kristen would send a ton of work our way, Angela said. She's very well connected. Great, Madeline thought. She could go from defending scumbag men to defending scumbag women. It did not feel like an improvement. You're the boss. Madeline shrugged. Whatever you do, Angela hissed, don't do anything to make Kristen angry. She and I are friends, but she's a little temperamental, and you're so. Madeline tried not to be insulted. She didn't quite succeed. I mean, you're just too nice, that's all. Nobody's that nice, Angela finished lamely. Angela had already had a couple of drinks. Normally, she wouldn't be so forthcoming, and what she really meant by nice was that Madeline was a complete pushover. I'm not that nice. Madeline protested. She was a divorce lawyer who represented repulsive characters. How nice could she be? Madeline certainly wasn't feeling very nice at the moment. She'd just have to survive until Sadie's 10 o'clock call, then she'd plead to having a babysitter emergency and take off. Madeline went to the bar and got a glass of wine and a cola. The cola was for her. She never drank in professional settings. She only drank with people who she knew and trusted, like Ami or Mark. Mark. She should call Mark. She should have invited him in the first place. It had been obvious that he'd wanted to come. She still couldn't wrap her mind around how much Mark liked her. He should be going out with someone more like the girls Chad was attracting these days. Young and thin. Cellulite-free and surprisingly smart. Smart. Not wise. There was a big difference. These girls must think that Chad would finally change for them because they were that special. Madeline had believed that, too, once upon a time. She hoped she was wiser now. Madeline set the glasses back down on the bar and took out her phone. She texted Mark. He texted right back. He'd be there in half an hour. Madeline picked up the glasses and headed toward Kristen, who was now sitting alone at the edge of the room. I thought you might like some wine, Madeline said, playing hostess. Sit down and talk to me, Kristen said as she accepted the glass. Nice party, Madeline said. What a lame thing to say. She'd have to do better than that. I know Angela sent you over here, Kristen said. Oh. There seemed no point in denying it. I'm glad you came over to talk. The fact is, I could use some advice, Kristen continued. Legal advice? In a way. I'm not really supposed to give out informal legal advice. I don't think Angela will mind. Kristen took a sip of wine and stared across the room. What's the nature of your concern? Madeline asked. She might as well take a stab at whatever Kristen's problem was. I'm having a problem with a man. A man? I started seeing my personal trainer a while back. Madeline wondered if it was anyone Mark knew. Yes. By seeing, I mean that he and I progressed past a strictly professional relationship. That didn't surprise Madeline. Kristen was the type. She was a very attractive woman. She was sharp, calculating, and possibly cruel, but some men went for that. The million-dollar question, of course, was, had the man in question been able to extricate himself from the relationship without blowback from Kristen? It's helpful if you come straight to the point. Madeline always gave this advice to new clients, and they almost never followed it. Clients rarely seemed conscious that they were being billed by the minute. Well, I broke up with him, Kristen said. That's not really a legal problem. Oh, but it is, Kristen said. He didn't take it well. He has embarrassing videos and photographs, and he's trying to blackmail me. This was getting interesting. It sounded just like a movie plot. How is he trying to blackmail you? He refuses to return them unless I pay him $500,000 or get back together with him. The fool. Like that's going to happen. Must be some awfully embarrassing pictures. That didn't surprise Madeline either. And if you don't pay? Or get back together with him? He won't say. But he's capable of anything. I'm terrified of him, to tell you the truth. Kristen paused. Tears formed in her eyes. Had she misjudged Kristen? Madeline wondered. Maybe Kristen did have a heart, after all? Or not? Madeline had seen her share of insincere tears. It was too early to tell if these were real. Kristen didn't seem like the type to stay in an abusive relationship, though, not unless she was the one doling out the abuse. Frankly, something felt very off about Kristen. Nothing Madeline could put a finger on, unless you counted Angela's revelation that Kristen had a history of not taking no for an answer, but there was something else there too, something deeply unsettling. And I take it you don't intend to pay this man who is blackmailing you off? Madeline asked. Certainly not. It's the principle of the thing. Madeline doubted principles came into it, but she certainly wasn't about to voice those doubts out loud. Did he take the pictures and video himself? Yes. Then he owns the copyright. Of course, were he to publish them, he'd be on shaky legal ground, but as long as he doesn't sell them to a third party or publish them, are you prepared to go to court to get them back? No. I just want to know how to put pressure on him without getting into trouble myself. What do you mean, pressure? Well, I don't intend to. This conversation is protected by client counsel confidentiality, right? I suppose. Although this is a little unconventional. Yes or no? Yes. So, I don't intend to burn down his house or anything, said Kristen, but I'm not averse to a little dirty work. You know, hold his dog for ransom or something. Cut his brake lines. Shake him up a little. I guess my question is, if something bad were to happen to him, accidentally, is it likely that a jury would convict solely on the basis of circumstantial evidence? You mean if something bad happens to this ex-lover of yours, could a jury convict you of murder, based solely on circumstantial evidence? I didn't say anything about murder. I mean, I don't actually want him to get hurt, but if in the process. I really can't advise you if you openly state you intend to engage in illegal activities, Madeline said. Of course not, and I never said anything about any illegal activities. Kristen smiled again, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. My advice is to negotiate payment in return for the photographs, Madeline told her. I'm sure this man realizes that $500,000 is a shot at the moon. If you can't pay him off, you'll need to go to court and try to get a judge to order him to return or destroy the photographs and videos. Kristen's smile got bigger and scarier. Pardon me for taking up so much of your valuable time. I thought you might want to help me. I can see I was wrong. Madeline had made an enemy without even trying. She should never have given in to Angela's demand that she entertain this woman. Madeline didn't trust this Kristen, but still, there was no doubt that the woman had been treated very badly by this fling of hers. Madeline could understand the desire for revenge. Of course, she herself had never indulged her own revenge fantasies to the point she had actually contemplated carrying them out. Kristen, on the other hand. I can see you're one of those women who feel no loyalty to other women. You have no sense of sisterhood. Kristen got up and walked away. Madeline was shaken, but the feeling wouldn't last long. She was used to dealing with unhinged people, although not usually in social settings. Oh, well. Mark would be there soon. Mark had never been inside Mackinaw's bar. The place was packed, but as he walked in the door, he spotted Madeline waiting for him. She looked so beautiful. He'd always been a sucker for a woman in a red dress, but he'd never seen a woman who looked this good in one. Madeline looked happy to see him, which wasn't the same thing as looking like she'd been having a good time. She led him through the crowded bar toward a room in the back. Before they went in, she paused. I don't know why I feel I need to tell you this, but I do. She looked slightly shaken up. There's a strange woman here. She was hitting me up for free legal advice, and the conversation didn't go so well. Anyway. It was a good thing he hadn't done the same thing. His instincts against telling Madeline about Kristen had been right. People were probably always trying to get Madeline to give them free legal advice. She's right over there. Madeline pointed her chin in the direction of the buffet. A tall woman in an elegant black dress stood with her back to them. She looked a lot like, it couldn't be. The woman turned around. It was Kristen Murphy. What was she doing there, and why was she trying to get legal advice out of Madeline? Maybe Kristen had found out that he was seeing Madeline. Maybe Angela was stalking Madeline, too. That wouldn't surprise him one bit. Kristen was coming their way. She was a good actress, but she wasn't good enough to cover up the shock that flickered across her face when she saw him there with Madeline. Good. She wasn't stalking Madeline. Yet. Of course, now that she'd seen them together, it was open season. Kristen reached them. Her face was stretched into a wide and threatening smile. She touched Madeline on the arm. Is this your date for the evening? Yes, Madeline and Mark both said at once. Mark could see Madeline bristling. At least Madeline could see through Kristen. Most people didn't realize what Kristen was actually like until it was too late. Madeline, I know we didn't hit it off a while ago, but, in the interest of sisterhood, I think you should know who you're dealing with here. Kristen looked straight at Mark. She didn't have to say anything more. Madeline blanched, and she moved away from Mark as if he'd suddenly contracted a highly contagious disease. What had Kristen told Madeline about him? It could be anything, knowing Kristen. Kristen's smile stretched even wider as she looked from Mark to Madeline and back to Mark again. It was obvious that Kristen felt she had struck a winning blow. Kristen melted back into the crowd. Mark found himself standing alone. Madeline was already retrieving her coat from a hook in the entry. Mark hurried to catch her before she slipped out the door. Madeline! What are you doing? Don't follow me. I don't know what Kristen told you. No telling. Whatever it was, I seriously doubt there's one bit of truth in it. How am I supposed to know what's true or not? I hardly know you. You said yourself that Kristen made you uncomfortable. You said she was weird. Being weird doesn't automatically make a person a liar. Just tell me what she said. She said, if it's even half true. How bad was it? And if Kristen hadn't already known who Madeline was, why had they been discussing him at all? Let's go somewhere else and talk about this. How about your house? We were going to end up there eventually anyway. That sounded bad. Presumptuous and cocky. Why was he always saying the wrong thing? He didn't usually. Madeline made him nervous, and when he was nervous. Were we? Said Madeline. Well, we aren't now. Okay, Then we'll talk right here. Tell me what she said. What difference does it make? It's still going to be her word against yours. No, it's not. That woman and I have history. No, kidding. She was leaving. 2 days until Christmas. Mark woke up angry. He'd gone to sleep angry, and the feeling hadn't dissipated. He couldn't let Kristen win like this. She had already taken his job from him. She wasn't going to take Madeline, too. He dialed Madeline's number. She was probably sleeping in, but he didn't care. He wanted to know if Joe had vouched for him. Madeline would believe her own brother. Madeline picked up after the second ring. Hello, Mark. She didn't sound angry, but she didn't sound happy either. In the background, he could hear Emily singing a barely recognizable Christmas carol. Did you talk to Joe? No, I can't reach him. Can I please tell you my side of the story? There was a long pause. Surely, she wasn't going to refuse to hear him out. She seemed more reasonable. Did she honestly believe all men were lying jerks just because Chad was? I'm listening. Good. She was going to listen to him. She was going to believe him. Everything was going to be all right. Kristen used to be a client of mine. So she says. She propositioned me, and I turned her down. That wasn't exactly true. He'd flirted a little with Kristen when they'd first met before he'd realized what the woman was like. This was Madeline he was talking to. He was serious about this woman. He'd better be absolutely honest with her. Actually, we went out a few times before I decided I wasn't interested. I wish I hadn't. It was a huge mistake. Obviously. So, she's your type, then? No, she's not my type. This was going spectacularly badly. Can we put a pin in the issue of my involvement with her in the first place and move on to what happened after that? Okay. Madeline sounded reluctant to let it go, but she did. Kristen didn't take rejection well. When I turned her down, she went to my boss and said if I wasn't fired, I'm not clear on exactly what she threatened him with, but she has connections all over. I think my old boss has several undocumented family members living in Seattle, and she found out somehow. I told you an abbreviated version of this the other night when we went out for a drink with Ami. I remember. Anyway, she must have something on the manager of every place I've gone to look for a job. Either that or she's able to bluff she does. But it's not just that. A couple of days ago, she showed up at my front door and threatened me. Threatened you? She was vague about what she planned to do, but she wasn't vague about the timeline. She gave me until Christmas Eve to change my mind, or else. Or else what? I don't know. Yesterday she scratched a reminder in the frost on my windshield. Do you have a dog? Madeline asked. Yes. Festus the bulldog. Why do you ask? I think she might be planning to do something to your dog. Kidnap him and hold him for ransom or something. It sounded ridiculous, but Mark wasn't laughing. What makes you think that? She made several suggestions of things she might do to you. Like what? She specifically said she wasn't going to burn your house down, but she did say something about cutting your brake lines. And you doubted me when I told you she was crazy? Even after she said things like that? Well, I know how it feels to be a woman scorned. I didn't think she was serious. People say all sorts of things about their exes. Believe me. I'm a divorce lawyer, I hear things like that all the time. What else did Kristen say about me? Madeline was silent on the other end. Mark wished he could see her face. Then he'd have at least a clue of what she was thinking. Kristen claimed that you're blackmailing her with compromising photos and video recordings. Mark couldn't help laughing. He shouldn't laugh. It wasn't funny at all. I don't find it very funny, Madeline said. You're right. It's more absurd than funny. So, you deny it? Categorically. It would have been much easier to prove he had done something. It was almost impossible to prove he hadn't. All right, Madeline said. Then tell me this, if Kristen had no idea you and I know each other, what would motivate her to make up such wild stories? She's a pathological liar and a sociopath. She was trying to get your sympathy, so you'd help her think up yet another way to ruin my life. I just don't know what to believe, said Madeline. She sounded as if she were on the verge of tears. All right. What was your first impression of me? I thought you were a complete player. How many mothers have you talked into sitting on Santa's lap? I'd really like to know. You were the only one. I swear. And your point is? I tried to get you to sit on my lap because I was afraid you'd leave, and I couldn't let you walk away not after all these. All these what? Never mind. My point is, what was your second impression of me? I thought you were a nice guy, Madeline said. Trustworthy? Yes. And you're not the trusting type. No. Okay. What was your first impression of Kristen? Trustworthy? No. Your instincts tell you I'm trustworthy, and Kristen isn't. Well, yes. But my instincts also told me to marry a man who belittled me, neglected me, and finally left me for another woman. Well, other women, if I'm going to be strictly accurate. I'm sorry about that, Mark said. Why should you be? He was the one who did all those things, not you. He really hurt you, didn't he? Yes, he did. And I'm not eager to go through that all over again with another man, said Madeline. I'm not going to hurt you. I would never hurt you. There was silence on the other end. She was crying. He'd made her cry. No, he hadn't. That jerk ex-husband of hers had made her cry. The silence at the end of the line was broken by the sound of Madeline blowing her nose. You're not mad, are you? Madeline sounded pitiful. Why should I be mad? Chad always got mad when I cried. He said tears are just a way women manipulate men. Seriously? No, I'm not mad. I get mad, but it takes a lot more than a few tears. Seriously? He got mad every time you cried? How about let's just drop this until after Christmas, Madeline said. She obviously didn't want to talk about Chad any longer. What are you doing for Christmas? No good. That sounded like he was fishing for an invitation to spend Christmas with her. Ami and I are going to our grandparents' house in Everett for Christmas dinner. What about Christmas Eve? There he went again. Ami usually comes over and her boyfriend if she has one. I think she may have just started seeing someone, but she's uncharacteristically cagey. Good. Madeline sounded almost normal again. I'll go to my parents' place for Christmas dinner. They still live out on the Olympic Peninsula, Mark said. And Christmas Eve? Festus and I usually sit in front of the fire. Sing a few carols. Roast a few chestnuts. Tell tall tales. Rabbits we've chased. Tires we've marked. That sort of thing. Madeline actually laughed. Maybe all was not lost. Well, have fun, Madeline said. And think about calling Ami. I'm sure she could keep Festus over at her house for a few days. She has a big backyard. Just until the other shoe drops with Kristen. And be careful. I'm always careful. I beg to differ. A man who gets involved with a sociopath is not the personification of prudence. So, you believe me, then? I don't know. Please talk to Joe. He can back me up. All right. I have to go. It's too quiet. Emily must be into something she's not supposed to be. Then Madeline was gone. Madeline normally enjoyed having a day off. It happened so rarely. Today, though, she was having trouble enjoying anything. Emily was in high spirits, however. She was excited because Santa was coming in 2 days. Except Santa wasn't coming. Not in the way Emily hoped. Before Joe had moved to Hong Kong, he'd always dressed up as Santa and brought a stocking for Emily on Christmas Eve. It was a tradition Emily missed terribly. Madeline had considered hiring someone to replace Joe, but that just didn't feel right. Visiting Santa at the mall was the best Emily was going to get this year. Emily would hang her stocking on the fireplace before going to bed, and in the morning, Madeline would tell her about hearing reindeer on the roof. When Emily would check, sure enough, her stocking would be full of little presents. When did kids stop believing in Santa Claus? This might be the last year Emily believed in the magic of Santa. Emily always spent Christmas Eve with Madeline and Ami. Soon after the divorce, Chad had insisted he wanted Emily to spend every other Christmas with him. However, after his own parents moved to Florida, Chad was finding it inconvenient to have Emily for the whole day. He certainly wasn't up for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Emily took displaying Christmas spirit very seriously and was adamant that everyone around her do the same. Chad found his daughter's enthusiasm irritating and tiring. This year, Chad had informed Madeline he would be dropping by her grandparents' house after Christmas dinner with Emily's presents. That would be it. Madeline, thanks to her late-night gift-wrapping frenzy, had very little to do that day. She'd contribute a couple of dishes to her grandparents' family dinner, but she didn't need to start cooking until Christmas Eve. Madeline tried calling Joe again, but there was no answer. She wanted to call Ami and tell her the whole sordid story of what had happened at last night's party, but little ears were listening. Instead of calling, Madeline sent her sister a series of texts containing an abbreviated version. Madeline wandered around the house, compulsively straightening. She'd been meaning to reorganize her closet. Maybe a good clear-out would calm her nerves. Emily dogged Madeline's footsteps and sang off-key Christmas carols at the top of her lungs. When she didn't know the words, she substituted, "F-A la 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 la." Madeline started pulling things out of her closet and laying them in piles on her bed. Emily danced around the room singing about reindeer and snowmen. "Is Santa coming this year?" Emily asked. "Of course. Santa comes every year." "No, I mean before I go to sleep." "Like he used to?" "Well, Santa's gotten much busier the last few years. Between the runaway birth rate and..." "Santa's run away?" No. I just meant there are more kids being born all the time, and that means Santa has to deliver more and more presents every year." "But I want to see Santa." "You did get to see Santa. You saw him at the mall." "That was fake Santa." "What makes you think that?" "I saw 2 Santas taking turns. One Santa went into a little room, and there was another Santa coming out at the same time." "I know there's only one real Santa. Don't you think Santa might get tired sometimes?" "He might need a substitute." "I guess. But the Santas at the mall weren't real. Only the one that comes to our house is real." There was no use arguing with watertight logic. Madeline missed her brother. "Come back, Joe." He had promised, before he left for Hong Kong, that he'd do his best to make it back every Christmas. So far, his best hadn't been good enough. Madeline started pulling shoes out of her closet. It was ridiculous to have this many shoes. There were some she'd worn only once or twice. Madeline went out to the garage and found some boxes. The women down at Ami's shelter could use these clothes. It was important to look good. Some very capable women came through the shelter, but they didn't stand a chance of getting back on their feet if they showed up for job interviews wearing t-shirts and old sweatpants. Mark called Ami right after he ate breakfast. Ami was very sympathetic. She herself had been stalked by a rejected ex, she said. She'd be happy to take Festus for a few days. Maybe he'd bark all night and keep her obnoxious neighbor from getting any sleep. Festus wasn't much of a barker, Mark said. But wouldn't a barking dog keep Ami awake, too? Nah. I found these great earplugs. I'd sleep through an earthquake with those things in. So, the neighbor's not a problem any longer? I wouldn't say that. He's started sending me flowers. I hate flowers. All they do is die. He's creepy, then? No, he's not creepy. He's kind of cute, actually. It's the principle of the thing. He must be made to suffer in proportion to his sins. And what are his sins, exactly? Deliberate and wanton pollution of the airwaves. Ah, I see. Except he didn't, but that was okay just as long as she was willing to keep Festus. Why don't you stay over, too? Ami suggested. Only make sure you're not followed. I don't want this Kristen person anywhere near me. Mark was tempted. He said he'd think about it. He could bring Festus over first thing in the morning. Kristen wouldn't do anything until Christmas Eve. At least he didn't think she would. I'll try and think of something, Ami said. What kind of something? You know. Take Kristen out. Neutralize her. Mark hoped Ami didn't mean what it sounded like she meant. Surely, she was kidding. If not, she was at least as crazy as Kristen. He'd never thought of Ami as crazy. Well, actually, she had always been borderline crazy, but crazy in a good way. What do you mean neutralize her? Okay. So, the phrase take her out might have scared you a little. Ami giggled. I didn't mean anything involving violence, well, very little violence and certainly no murder. Good to know. What are Kristen's weaknesses? I don't know. Innocent personal trainers. So, men in general? I'd say that's true. Does she have a type? I don't know. Well, we'll soon find out. What do you mean? I'm having the beginnings of a brilliant idea. I'm a little scared of your brilliant ideas. No, this one is truly brilliant. If I'm successful, it will also take care of something else that's been bothering me. Do I want to know the details? No, you certainly do not. Can I have Kristen's phone number? Why? Trust me. Do I have to? Yes. Well, just don't involve me in your plans. Don't worry. I don't need you at all for what I have in mind. Mark did trust Ami. Almost. He trusted Ami had his best interests at heart. Whether her brilliant scheme, whatever it was, would make things better or worse, he wasn't so sure. For now, he had to go to work. It was his last shift as Santa, and he couldn't be more ready to give up the gig. What he'd do to make money after this, he had no idea. He should call Stan up and tell him he was coming to Portland straight after Christmas. Stan's offer solved all of his problems, or at least all of his problems save one. Was Madeline going to come around eventually, or was he wasting his time? Christmas Eve. Madeline woke up with a start. Everything was moving. Then she heard a childish voice. It wasn't an earthquake, it was Emily was bouncing up and down on the end of the bed. It's Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve. Rainbows and candy canes. Flying storks and landy lanes. Rudolph and Snoodolph and Effie la 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 la. Making up your own songs again, girly? Madeline couldn't help but smile. Emily was just so excited. Can we please make waffles? Sure. When is Aunt Ami coming over? Ami had called late the evening before. It was a very strange call. Ami said she tried to make it by 6 that evening for Christmas Eve dinner, but they shouldn't start to worry until 7. She had something to take care of, something urgent. She might be done earlier, Ami told Madeline, but she didn't know for sure how long her task would take. It wasn't like Ami to be so secretive. Ami usually told her sister everything, so Madeline didn't pry. It was probably just some last-minute Christmas shopping or something. Maybe Ami was creating some elaborate handmade surprise for Emily. Last Christmas, Ami had created a child-sized gingerbread playhouse out of cardboard for Emily. Emily had played with the thing non-stop until July when it was more duct tape than gingerbread, and Madeline finally insisted it be given a respectful cremation in the backyard fire pit. After breakfast, Emily went off to her room to play, and Madeline set to work on her contributions for Christmas dinner. She was just pouring the cranberry gelatin into the mold to set when the doorbell rang. Emily came flying down the stairs. It's Aunt Ami. I doubt it. She's not coming till tonight. We'll just have to open the door and see who it is. Emily clung to her mother's waist and peeked out from under one arm as Madeline opened the door. Madeline screamed. She actually screamed. She just couldn't believe it. It was Joe. Emily launched herself at her Uncle Joe. Emily might not have seen her uncle in person since she was 3, but they would get on video chat together and giggle up a storm. At least Emily would giggle. Joe wasn't the giggly type, but he was good at making silly faces. Emily loved her Uncle Joe almost as much as she loved her Aunt Ami. Madeline didn't see a taxi. She didn't see a rental car either. How did you get here? Ah. A friend dropped me off. Might that be your friend Mark? It might be. Joe looked far too smug. Was Madeline the only one who didn't see a happily ever after for her and Mark? Her own family was conspiring against her. They seemed so sure. Neither Ami nor Joe had ever warmed to Chad. That was a point in favor of their wisdom and discretion. Maybe she should listen to the two people who loved her the most. Mark hadn't slept well. He hadn't had a good night's sleep since the whole Kristen thing had started. He kept having nightmares that she had gotten into his house and was standing over his bed watching him sleep. Just recalling the dreams made his skin crawl. Mark had gotten up early to go pick up Joe from the airport. Mark had dropped Joe off at Madeline's, but he'd made Joe promise to give him time to drive off before ringing the bell. Now he just had to keep Joe's arrival secret from Ami. The plan was for Joe to surprise Ami that evening when she came over to Madeline's. Mark loaded Festus into the car and took him over to Ami's. Festus liked Ami. Apparently, Festus was a good judge of character. Festus loved Ami almost as much as he hated Kristen. Ami was happy to have Festus. She gave him an old blanket in the corner of the kitchen and the run of the house. It was too cold to leave him outside, she said. Besides, she liked the company. You staying, too? I don't see a suitcase. Mark hadn't decided, actually. He probably should in case those nightmares were prophetic. I have some errands to run, he told Ami. I'll decide before noon and get back to you. I'll be busy this afternoon, Ami said. How about I give you a key, just in case? Mark didn't say no. How's your brilliant scheme coming along? He asked. So far so good. I won't know until this evening if I've been successful. Madeline was worried. It was 6:30, and Ami hadn't shown up or called. Sure, she'd said not to worry until after 7, but Madeline couldn't help wondering what was keeping her sister. She tried not to wonder what Mark was up to that evening. She hoped he had plans. The more time that passed since her disastrous meeting with Kristen, the more she was convinced Kristen was the one who was lying. Joe was also working hard to coax her around to his viewpoint. Joe was convinced Mark was telling the truth, and Kristen was a sociopath. What's Mark doing this evening? Madeline couldn't resist quizzing Joe. I got the impression he had plans. Joe looked highly amused. I hope he does. I'd hate to think of him sitting home alone with no one but his dog for company. Oh, he took Festus over to Ami's house just in case. Emily, who kept running over to the window to see if Aunt Ami was coming, suddenly shouted and ran to the door. Aunt Ami's here. Hide, Uncle Joe. Emily was yelling loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. There was no chance of postponing the surprise by hiding Joe in the kitchen. Madeline went to the door and let Ami in. She nearly knocked Madeline over to get to Joe and tackled him so hard he went down on the hardwood floor of the entry. I can't believe it. I just can't believe it. Ami kept saying over and over. Madeline almost couldn't believe it herself, and she'd had all day to get used to the idea. This was the best Christmas she'd had in years. It was almost perfect. The only person missing was... Where's Mark? Ami asked. Joe pointed at Madeline. I understand he wasn't invited. Wasn't invited? You mean right now he's sitting in my cold kitchen eating something microwaved and listening to Festus snore? Your kitchen? Madeline demanded. What would he be doing in your kitchen? I've invited him to stay for a while until Kristen shows her hand. Speaking of Kristen, Mark's moving in with you? Madeline didn't like it. She didn't like it at all. I suppose you could put it that way. Jealous? Certainly not. It just seems a little inappropriate, that's all. I have a guest bed. I know, but still. Joe was laughing again. Believe me, he said, there's no danger of Mark transferring his affections to Ami. Thanks very much, Joe. That's not much of a compliment, Ami protested. Well, Mark's very fond of you, Ami, but it's Madeline he's been in love with for the last decade. It went dead silent. Ami and Joe looked at Madeline. What? I didn't know, okay. Sure, said Joe. I really didn't. I mean, I knew he had a crush on me way back when, but I didn't know, that's crazy. Joe, you're exaggerating. I am absolutely not exaggerating. Emily, who had been out in the kitchen watching the chicken roasting in the oven and filching cookies off the counter, returned to the living room and said, the timer's going off. Madeline rushed out to the kitchen, eager to get away from Mommy and Joe. Joe couldn't be right. Sure, Mark was attracted to her, but how could he be in love with her? They hadn't seen each other in so many years. It was time to eat, she announced on her return. Normally, they opened presents and then ate, but Ami had been so late that now the food was ready. They sat down around the table and filled their plates. Madeline was just about to take her first bite when there was an awful racket of clumping and scraping up on the roof. Madeline jumped up in alarm. "Don't worry, Mommy. It's Santa." Emily was jumping up and down, her eyes shining. "I am 100% sure that's not Santa," Madeline said. The sound of jingling bells joined the clumping and scraping. Emily rushed to the kitchen and started trying to wrestle the fire extinguisher down from the wall. "What are you doing, Emily? Help! Santa's going to get burned up." Emily was distraught. She pulled at the fire extinguisher, but she couldn't get it down. Joe fell off his chair, laughing. Ami was looking at everyone in her family as if they had all gone mad, and she was the only sane one left. "Santa is not going to come down the chimney," Madeline insisted. "In fact, I'm not at all sure that's really Santa." "The smart thing to do would be to go outside and warn him," Joe suggested. "Warn who?" Madeline was getting suspicious. Had Joe hired a Santa for Emily? Did he know anyone who might? Yes, he did. Mark. It was only logical. Madeline marched outside and looked up on the roof. It was Santa, all right. Santa had blue eyes. Madeline bet if she got close, they would have little flecks of green in them and a roguish twinkle. "Get down off my roof, right now," Madeline yelled. "Don't hurt Santa's feelings, Mommy." Emily tugged at Madeline's sleeve. "He has to be on the roof. It's his landing pad. Please, Santa, if you would be so kind as to come down off my roof," Madeline yelled up again through gritted teeth. Santa came over to the edge of the roof. "You must be Emily," Santa said. "Where's your sleigh?" Emily asked. "It dropped me off. The reindeer are taking a hay and oats break. They'll be back for me later. Please. Can you eat supper with us?" Emily said. Santa looked down at Madeline. Joe and Ami were sniggering in the background. Madeline kicked discreetly backward in the direction of their shins, but they jumped out of the way. "Maybe you should ask your mother if it's okay for me to come in?" Santa suggested. "Of course, it's okay," Emily said. "You're Santa. Why didn't you come last year?" "Hip surgery. Fell on the ice. Had to send out my backup elves to deliver the presents." "You got your presents, didn't you?" Emily nodded. This back-and-forth nonsense could go on for ages. Madeline thought about the food getting cold and the gravy congealing. "Come inside and eat, Santa," Madeline said. "And watch out for my gutters when you drop off the porch roof." Mark was trying to keep gravy out of his beard. It was a good thing this was his swan song as Santa. Next week, he'd take the costume back to the place where he'd rented it. The beard was his to keep. Beards, the woman at the costume shop had informed him, were purchase-only items. Now he understood why. Emily was ecstatic to be eating Christmas Eve dinner while sitting next to Santa. She barely touched her food, she was so excited. Joe had been right. This had been a good idea. But maybe Madeline didn't think so. She was too quiet. After supper, they all went into the living room to open presents. Joe's presents to his family were hidden in the big pockets of Mark's Santa coat. Mark pulled them out one by one. Emily opened hers first. Her present was a set of elaborately painted Japanese dolls which opened up to expose smaller and smaller dolls, one inside another. There was also candy and sparkly barrettes and a little sequined purse in the shape of a butterfly. Emily set to work filling her row of hollow dolls with candies. Ami was next. Joe had gotten her a necklace. "This is great, Joe. I don't know if I got you anything half as good." "What do you mean?" Madeline picked it out. "We went in on it together." "You'd better open it now, so I can find out what it is." Joe protested, but Emily was already fishing his gift out from under the tree. Joe opened it and held up the watch. "I thought you needed another one," Madeline said. "You only have about 15 already." "I do like watches," Joe said. "I like to think of myself as a collector." Mark watched as Madeline opened her gift from Joe. It was a gold necklace just like Ami's but with different colored stones. It must have cost a fortune. Ami had been right. The watch didn't compare. "It's lovely, Joe. I'm so glad you're here with us this year. These last few Christmases just haven't been the same without you." It was time for pulling the rest of the gifts out from under the tree, but Emily stopped them. "Where's Santa's present?" she asked. Santa doesn't get presents. He just gives them," Madeline said. "That's not fair," said Emily. "It certainly isn't," agreed Ami. "It is one of the great injustices of our time." "Wait here. Nobody move," Emily said and darted up the stairs. Halfway up, she remembered her manners and shouted back down. "Please wait there, and please don't move." Everyone was laughing but Madeline. She was too quiet. Mark hoped he hadn't overstepped a line somewhere. Joe had reassured him beforehand that even if Madeline was annoyed at first, she never stayed mad for long. He'd go as soon as Emily came back. They could open the rest of the presents without him. He felt the one tiny box remaining in his pocket. He had been sure he wanted to give it to Madeline, but now he wasn't. Maybe giving Madeline a present was a bad idea. Maybe he'd better just put that gift back in his sock drawer and let it sit there for another 4 years. Emily was gone for a long time. When she finally came back, she was carrying a box almost as big as she was. It was badly wrapped in paper festooned with pink and purple snowmen. "Here's your present, Santa." Emily's eyes glowed. Mark took the box and set it down on the floor. "Open it! Open it!" Emily jumped up and down. Mark looked over at Madeline. She shrugged her shoulders and gave him a half-smile. Mark started to unwrap the box, but he was going too slowly for Emily. She helped him tear the paper off. "I used a lot of tape, didn't I?" She struggled to get the last of the paper off. Emily's eyes were shining. Mark smiled at her through his beard, and she beamed back at him. Mark opened up the flaps of the box and looked inside. A broad grin spread across his face as he reached inside the box. Madeline wanted to hug Mark. He held up the mangy stuffed elephant as if it were the best present he'd ever received. "His name is Riggs," Emily informed Santa. Riggs was barely recognizable as an elephant anymore. He had survived several trips through the wash after being dropped in the toilet. He had endured being baptized in cherry-flavored fruit punch, and he'd lost a leg that had been inexpertly sewn back on by Ami, only to eventually lose it again. His trunk had become twisted and, in an attempt to bring him back to his former glory, Emily had covered him with uneven strokes using a gray magic marker. "Riggs is great," Mark said as he made the elephant raise his trunk and trumpet. "I bet you've done lots of fun things with Riggs." "Yes. Riggs is my favorite stuffed animal in the whole world." Madeline wondered when Emily was going to start having second thoughts about letting Riggs go. Up until recently, Emily had insisted on sleeping with Riggs tucked under her arm. Now Riggs slept at the end of the bed. He was a guard elephant, Emily claimed. Just like a guard dog, only he ate less. I love Riggs, Mark said. There's one thing, though, that worries me. Emily's eyes got big. My reindeer are awfully large, and they can be terrible bullies, Rudolph, in particular. That's not nice. No, I talk to Rudolph about it all the time, but he just won't listen. Like Samuel F. He never waits his turn. Miss Hill keeps telling him to wait, but he never listens. It sounds like Rudolph and Samuel F. have a lot in common. Emily nodded. Mark handed Riggs reverently back to Emily. I think you'd better take care of him for me until I get Rudolph back in line. I wouldn't want Riggs to get hurt. Okay, Emily said, looking relieved. She threw her arms around Mark and gave him an enthusiastic hug. Madeline looked at Mark and mouthed thank you over the top of Emily's head. And that was the moment when every doubt she had about him melted away. Madeline still questioned Joe's claim that the man had spent the last decade madly in love with her, but, if that was true, she was one lucky woman. Mark looked over Emily's head at Madeline. She was smiling at him. He wanted so badly to walk over and kiss her, but now was not the moment. Instead, he took the tiny box out of his pocket. Look what I found, Emily. Another present. Who is it for? Emily tried to find a name tag, but there wasn't one. This one is for your mother, Mark said. My friend Mark asked me to deliver it to her personally. Emily grabbed the tiny box and took it to her mother. Madeline opened it and took out an antique cameo pin. She didn't speak. She just looked at him. It was a full minute before she found her voice. This is exactly like the cameo pin belonging to her great-grandmother, the cameo pin Madeline had lost the weekend she'd graduated from law school. She'd pinned it to her graduation gown as a tribute to her great-grandmother, the first female lawyer in the state of Minnesota, but the clasp had come loose somehow, and after the ceremony, the cameo was missing. Mark and Joe and Ami had spent hours helping Madeline search the lawn where the graduation had been held. They had searched until it got dark, but they never found the brooch. Let me see. Ami interrupted. How in the world did you find this? Madeline asked. He'd spent years searching internet auction sites, but he could hardly admit to it. Oh, I mean, my friend Mark happened to come across it, and he thought of you. I don't know what to say, Madeline said. She walked over to Mark and kissed him on the cheek, or what would have been his cheek if it had not been covered with a white woolly beard. Thank you for delivering it, Santa. It's the nicest present anyone has ever given me. It was worth it. She might not love him back the way he wished she would, but at least he'd made her smile. She didn't have nearly enough reasons to smile. Time for bed, Emily, Madeline announced. Emily begged to stay up a little longer, but Madeline pointed out it was already 2 hours past her regular bedtime. Maybe Aunt Ami will tuck you in. Emily was satisfied. She trotted upstairs to brush her teeth on the condition that Aunt Ami would be up to read her a bedtime story. She came racing back down a minute later. I forgot to tell Santa goodbye, she said. I won't see you again until next year. Maybe not even then, Mark thought. By next year he might no longer be a part of their lives, even dressed up as Santa. Madeline hurried Emily through her goodbyes and sent her upstairs for a second try at brushing her teeth. That was his cue to go. I'd better take off, Mark said. Already? Joe protested. Mark looked at Madeline. She was smiling at him, but he wasn't sure what it meant. Actually, Mark, Ami said, after I'm done reading Emily her bedtime story, I was thinking you and Joe might help me finish up a little project I'm working on. Sure, Mark answered. What kind of project? Joe asked. Joe had likely seen the sorts of projects Ami sometimes came up with, and he seemed unwilling to commit until he had a better idea of what he was getting into. I'm doing a social experiment. Social experiment? Yes, and all to benefit a very good cause. And what good cause would that be? Joe asked his sister. You know our friend Mark here has been having some trouble with a certain female lately? Mark hoped whatever Ami had done hadn't just made a bad situation worse, but he saw no point in voicing his doubts. Yes, I was aware of that, Joe was saying. Well, I might have succeeded in putting a spoke in her wheels. Ami! What did you do? Madeline sounded extremely skeptical and a little concerned. It remains to be seen, Ami said. Now, much as I'd love to include you in this little outing, Madeline, somebody has to stay here with Emily. Fine with me, Madeline answered. Your brilliant ideas usually end up scaring me half to death. How often do Ami's projects succeed? Mark asked. It's about 50-50, Joe answered. Incidentally, I've already set this plan in motion, Ami said. There's no going back, so you two might as well come along with me to see how things worked out. And why do you need us? Joe was suspicious. Just in case. Just in case of what? You'll see, Ami said. Why won't you tell us now? Joe asked. Are you coming or not? Let's go, Joe, Mark said. Then he thought of something. Ami, can I get away with going in the Santa suit? I don't see why not. Madeline fell asleep on the couch. She woke up to the sound of Ami's car in the driveway. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. They came back with an extra person. Ami introduced him as Jagger, her next-door neighbor. This was the carpenter, the loud one, the one she hated, or so she had claimed on many previous occasions. But Ami wasn't looking at him like she hated him. She made no explanation for Jagger's presence. Ami was barely in the door before she demanded Madeline's laptop. She inserted a flash drive and pulled up a video file. You have to see this, Ami said, thrusting the laptop under Madeline's nose. Hit play when you're ready. Madeline looked over at Mark. He was looking shell-shocked under his Santa beard but slightly relieved. Good. Whatever Ami had done must not have backfired, at least not too badly. Madeline hit play. It was a split screen. The first camera was aimed at the outside of Mark's front door. The second showed the inside of Mark's living room. How did you do this? Madeline asked. Oh, Jagger has this friend who's got a van fitted out with surveillance equipment, Ami said like it was the most natural thing in the world to have a next-door neighbor with access to professional quality spy gear. Earlier today, Jagger and I broke into Mark's houseboat and put up the cameras. They're tiny, top of the line, almost impossible to spot. I thought you were a carpenter. Madeline looked over at Jagger. I am. My friend owed me a favor. Madeline let it go and returned her attention to the video. 2 people could be seen approaching the front door. That's Kristen! Madeline exclaimed. You're surprised? Ami asked. And that looks like Chad? Amy inquired. Why, yes, it is. You can thank me for that. I'm not sure I'm ready to start thanking you for anything yet. I don't understand what's going on here. Would telling you Chad is sitting in jail right now waiting to be charged with attempted arson help you feel any gratitude at all? Arson? Yes, arson. Mark still looked a little traumatized. They didn't succeed, for which I'm very grateful. Not to sound like a total punster, but don't you think that was playing with fire, Ami? But why would they try to burn down Mark's houseboat? Madeline asked. Maybe Kristen has watched a few too many crime thrillers? I don't know. I had a feeling that was her plan all along. After what you said she told you about not planning to burn down Mark's houseboat, I was almost certain that was what she would do if Mark didn't give in to her demands, Ami said. Huh? Seriously. People always preemptively deny whatever it is they actually intend to do. Okay. But what's Chad doing there? While they'd been talking, the video had continued playing. Kristen and Chad had now managed to break in the front door. It wasn't much of a front door. Chad had jammed a crowbar between the door frame and the lock, and it had popped right open. I may have had something to do with Chad being there, Ami said. I've been texting him all day, pretending to be Kristen. Then I text Kristen, pretending to be Chad. I got one of those cheap disposable cell phones. I bought it with cash. It's untraceable. She's brilliant, Jagger said. Brilliant? Or crazy? Joe protested. They might have burned Mark's house down. I'm just glad Festus wasn't in there, Mark said. Yes, I wouldn't put it past Kristen to shoot him, said Ami. What exactly were you texting back and forth between Chad and Kristen? Madeline asked. I mean, they've never even met. How did you manage to make them believe they were communicating with each other? Oh, but they have met. I found out that they have several social connections, so it didn't seem quite so bizarre that they'd contact each other. I might have let slip to Chad, pretending to be Kristen of course, that Mark was seeing you. He didn't seem to like that. It still confused Madeline why Chad could pal around with half the female population of Seattle, but she wasn't allowed to date anyone at all. As for Kristen's grievances against Mark, Ami continued, I just repeated the lies she told you. I managed to work them both up into states of not-so-righteous indignation, and asked Kristen a few leading questions, and before you know it, those two were on board with taking drastic and illegal action to teach Mark a lesson he wouldn't forget. Are they doing what I think they're doing? Madeline asked, returning her attention to the screen. Chad appeared to be pouring the contents of a gas can around the living room floor while Kristen watched. They're doing exactly what you think they're doing, said Ami. Please tell me they didn't get a chance to light that. Just watch, Ami insisted. Abruptly, the video cut off. The police arrived before they got around to igniting the accelerant. Jagger watched the whole thing go down, said Ami. So, Jagger was there when the police arrived? I was still in the back of the van, watching through the cameras. I didn't show my face. I didn't want Kristen to get a look at me, Jagger said. I talked to the police, though, said Mark. Joe, Ami, and I arrived just as they were putting Kristen and Chad into the back of the patrol car. Jagger was the one who called the police? Madeline was still confused. Yeah, Jagger said. I waited a little while to put in the call. I said I lived in the neighborhood and was walking by with my dog and saw that Mark's door was kicked in. Wasn't that a bit risky letting them go so far as to splash gasoline all over the place? Madeline asked. Poor Mark. Was he regretting getting involved with her family again? Maybe a little. Jagger grinned. Mark looked across the room at Madeline. She was looking back at him. He wished everyone else would go away and leave them alone. They finally did. Ami and Jagger left together. Joe went off to bed. Mark stood by the fireplace, waiting. Madeline stayed where she was, keeping the couch between them. "Do you believe me now?" Mark asked. "Yes. That's all you have to say? After all those horrible things you thought about me?" Madeline walked up to him and put a finger to his lips. "Shut up. That's kind of rude," Mark scolded. "Shut up and kiss me." He imagined this moment 1,000 times, and it was every bit as good as he'd imagined it. No. It was better. Sure, the woolly Santa beard was getting in the way a little, but it didn't matter. Mark finally pulled away and looked into Madeline's eyes. "Is what Joe was saying true?" Madeline asked. "You're going to have to be a little more specific. Is what Joe said about you being in love with me absolutely 100% true?" Then he kissed her again. The end of February. Madeline stood in the middle of the street and waved until Mark's car turned the corner and drove out of sight. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry, but she'd broken that promise before he'd even made it out of the driveway. Portland might be only a commuter flight away, and she'd see him the very next weekend, but she couldn't wait until she tied up all her loose ends in Seattle and joined him in Portland for good. Madeline was looking forward to Monday. She shouldn't be getting so much pleasure from anticipating the look on Angela's face when Madeline informed her she was quitting. Angela would be sorry to lose Madeline, but Madeline wasn't the least bit sad to be leaving. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, her days in divorce court would be over. Not everything was rosy, of course. It would be hard to leave Ami here, and Chad hadn't been too happy when Madeline had informed him of her intentions. However, since he only had Emily every other weekend and was currently out on bail until his court date, he wasn't in a position to create too much of a fuss. He was looking at jail time, and so was Kristen. Madeline felt a tiny bit sorry for them both. Maybe she shouldn't, but she did. There was also the house to sell. Chad hadn't been too happy about that either, but it was her house now, and he didn't have any say in the matter. Madeline already had a job lined up through someone Ami knew. She could start whenever she was ready. She'd be representing victims of domestic violence. There wasn't much money in it, but Madeline didn't care. She was so happy for Mark. He was finally realizing his dream of owning his own gym. Well, part ownership, anyway. And after they got married, she'd buy out his friend Stan, and it would be their gym for good. Madeline took her mitten off and looked at her hand. It was strange to have a ring on her finger again. She turned her hand back and forth in the light to make the stone sparkle. It had belonged to Mark's grandmother. When Mark had gone to his parents' house for Christmas Day, he'd come back with the ring. He'd carried it around until Valentine's Day, then he'd proposed. It was awfully quick, but Madeline wasn't having second thoughts. Mark was everything that Chad had never been. Madeline's phone jingled. "Hi, Mark. Just making sure you haven't forgotten me. Out of sight. Out of mind. Not a chance. I'm the luckiest man on earth." She didn't know how to react when Mark said sweet things like that. She wasn't used to it. Recent history might indicate otherwise. "I beg to differ." "Why?" "Because all the bad stuff had to happen to get to the good stuff." "Maybe you're right." "I know I'm right. Just because you're 6 years older than me doesn't." "Are we about to have our first fight?" "I thought we already got that over with." "We weren't a couple then." "Weren't we?" No. He had loved her way back then. He loved her even more now. She had no doubts, just delicious anticipation of a long and happy life together, Mark and her and Emily together, a family. "Are you still there?" Mark asked. "Yes. I was just distracted by happy thoughts." No fighting then? No. We can save fighting for later. Why not? We have all the time in the world. The end.